Hi, I'm Avery Thompson. Before I get into my story, please like and subscribe if you're interested in hearing about how I've dealt with some major family drama. Trust me, you won't want to miss this ride. I'm 32, doing great in my marketing career, and married to Michael, my high school sweetheart. On paper, things look perfect, but let me tell you, family dynamics can be a real nightmare. At our last family dinner, my mother-in-law, Barbara, looked at my dress and said, "Avery, darling, that dress is interesting." Her voice was dripping with fake sweetness. "I guess it's what's fashionable these days," she added. I forced a smile and replied, "Thanks, Barbara. It's actually a designer piece I got for a great price." Michael squeezed my hand under the table, his silent way of telling me to let it go, but it's hard to ignore years of subtle insults and coldness. Then, Michael's dad jumped in, completely ignoring me. "So Michael, how's that big project at work going? And don't even get me started on Samantha, Michael's sister. She's the worst." She smirked and said, "Oh Avery, remember when you tried to bring that vegan casserole to Thanksgiving? Bless your heart for trying." I held back my frustration, thinking about how they accidentally left my dish in the kitchen that year. I just smiled and said, "Well, you know me, always trying something new." Michael gave me an apologetic look, knowing how hard I'd tried with his family, but he always hoped things would get better on their own. Flashback to our wedding day, I was so excited to officially join the family. Barbara greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the Petersons," she said. "I hope you'll fit in, eventually." 5 years later, I'm still waiting for that eventually. Back at the dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment alone. I stared at my reflection, giving myself a pep talk. "You're doing this for Michael," I whispered. "Stay strong." I returned to the dining room with a fake smile and asked, "Who's ready for dessert?" Trying to lighten the mood, Samantha rolled her eyes and said, "Some of us actually watch our figures, Avery." Before I could respond, Samantha's face twisted in pain. She clutched her side and gasped, I can't breathe." The room exploded into chaos. "Samantha," Barbara screamed, rushing to her daughter. "Call an ambulance," Michael's dad yelled, panic clear in his voice as Samantha collapsed to the floor. I froze, stunned by what was happening. Despite the years of cold treatment, seeing her like this hit me hard. I snapped out of it and shakily dialed 911. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. I heard myself saying, "Help is on the way," though I wasn't sure who I was trying to reassure. As we waited for the ambulance, the air was thick with fear and uncertainty. I couldn't help but wonder, would this crisis bring us closer together or push us further apart? The waiting room was a blur of white walls and the sharp smell of antiseptic. I couldn't shake the image of Samantha collapsing at dinner. Despite our differences, I never wanted anything bad to happen to her. Michael was pacing back and forth, his face full of worry. A doctor in a white coat approached us. "I'm Dr. Chen. I have news about Samantha," he said. We all gathered around him, holding our breath. "I'm afraid Samantha has end-stage renal disease. Her kidneys are failing, and she urgently needs a transplant." The news hit us hard. Mrs. Peterson started sobbing, and Mr. Peterson's face went pale. "What are our options, doctor?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. "We need to find a suitable donor quickly," Dr. Chen replied. "Family members are usually the best match. I'd recommend testing all of you." The next few days were a whirlwind of tests and anxious waiting. One by one, the Peterson family was ruled out as potential donors. The atmosphere grew tense with each negative result. Then came the shocking news. "Avery, you're a perfect match for Samantha," Dr. Chen announced. The room fell silent, and I felt everyone's eyes on me, filled with a mix of hope and expectation. Suddenly, the Petersons' attitude toward me changed. Mrs. Peterson, who had always been cold, was now all smiles. "Oh, Avery, dear, what wonderful news," she gushed, grabbing my hands. Mr. Peterson chimed in, "We always knew you were special. Avery, you're truly a blessing to this family." Their sudden affection felt strange and insincere. I mumbled something vague and excused myself to get some air. Later that evening, while I was getting coffee in the hospital cafeteria, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson cornered me. "Avery, we need to talk," Mr. Peterson said, his tone serious. "We know it's a big decision, but Samantha's life is at stake." Mrs. Peterson added, tears in her eyes, "You're part of this family now, and family takes care of each other." Mr. Peterson finished. "Michael would do the same for you in a heartbeat," Mr. Peterson said, their words making me feel trapped. I need time to think about this. It's a major surgery, I stammered. Time, Mrs. Peterson's voice rose. Samantha doesn't have time. Now, Mr. Peterson tried to calm his wife, before turning back to me. Just think about how this could affect your future with Michael. He's very close to his sister, you know. Their veiled threat hung in the air. I muttered something about needing to talk to Michael and hurried away, my head spinning. That night, as I pretended to sleep, I overheard Michael talking to his parents in the hallway. She just needs a little convincing, Michael said. I'll talk to her. Avery will come around. I'm sure of it. She has to. We can't lose Samantha, Mrs. Peterson hissed. Do whatever it takes, Michael. My heart pounded as I lay there. The family I had tried so hard to please was now plotting against me. I felt alone, scared, and utterly betrayed. The conversation left me in shock. I couldn't believe what Michael and his parents were planning. It was time to dig deeper into the family's past. I started with Samantha's medical records. It wasn't easy, but I managed to get them. What I found was shocking. Years of heavy drinking and drug use had destroyed her kidneys. The Petersons knew all along, but had hidden the truth, enabling her behavior. I reached out to Michael's ex, Sarah. Hey Sarah, it's Avery. Can we meet for coffee? I need to ask you something important. Sarah agreed to meet, and over lattes, she spilled the truth. The Petersons? They're users, Avery. They treated me like family until I wasn't useful anymore. Then they threw me away like I was nothing. Her words sent chills down my spine. Everything made sense now. The cold treatment, the sudden kindness when they needed my kidney. I was just another pawn in their game. Next, I dug into the family business. After some creative digging, I uncovered a web of financial irregularities, and Michael's name was all over it. Confronting Michael was the hardest part. I laid out everything I'd discovered. What the hell, Avery? You've been snooping behind my back? Michael snapped. Can you blame me after what I overheard? I shot back. That was a private conversation, and what's wrong with wanting to save my sister's life? It's not about saving Samantha, it's about how your family has treated me for years, and now, suddenly, I'm their savior. You're being selfish. This is my sister we're talking about. Michael's face turned red. And I'm your wife, but that doesn't seem to matter to you or your family, I replied. The argument escalated until I dropped the bomb about the business. You're involved in fraud, Michael. Did you think I wouldn't find out? His face went pale. It's not what you think. We had to do it to keep the business afloat. By breaking the law? By putting everything at risk? Michael stormed out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next day, I called a family meeting. Everyone gathered in the Petersons' living room, tension hanging thick in the air. I've made my decision, I announced. I won't be donating my kidney. The room erupted. Barbara jumped up, her face twisted with rage. You ungrateful little, after everything we've done for you. Mr. Peterson joined in. You'll regret this, Avery. We'll make sure Michael sees you for who you really are. Samantha, pale and weak, spoke up. I knew you were never really part of this family. I stood my ground as insults and threats flew. Michael sat there silently, torn between his family and me. I've seen your true colors now, I said calmly. You've used and manipulated people for years. I won't be your next victim, I said as I turned to leave. Michael finally spoke up. Avery, if you walk out that door, don't bother coming back. I paused at the doorway and looked back at the family that had never truly accepted me. Goodbye, Michael. I hope you realize what you're losing before it's too late. After that explosive meeting, I knew there was no turning back. I had to protect myself and expose the truth about the Petersons. I spent weeks gathering evidence, financial records, emails, even recordings of conversations. It felt like solving a twisted puzzle, each piece revealing more of their dark secrets. I reached out to my old friend, Emma, whom I hadn't spoken to in years. I really need your help, I said, my voice cracking. Avery? Oh my God, what's wrong? She asked, genuinely concerned. I told her everything, the manipulation, the fraud, the kidney donation mess. Emma listened without judgment and then said, You're coming to stay with me, no arguments. Her support was a lifeline. I realized how isolated I'd become in my marriage, cut off from my own support system. As I reconnected with old friends and family, I grew stronger every day. One night, after triple-checking my anonymous tip, I hit send on an email to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. My heart raced as I watched the sending icon spin. There was no going back now. The investigation moved quickly. Within weeks, news broke of a major fraud probe into the Peterson family business. I watched from a distance as their carefully crafted image fell apart. Michael called me in a panic. "Avery, what have you done? The feds are all over the office." "I didn't do anything, Michael," I said calmly. "The truth is finally coming out." He paused, then said quietly, "I'm sorry, Avery. I should have listened to you, but it was too late for apologies. I had already filed for divorce, using the evidence I'd gathered to ensure a fair settlement. In the end, Michael stayed loyal to his family, not me. The fallout was huge. The company was charged with fraud and embezzlement, and Michael and his parents faced serious jail time. Samantha's substance abuse issues came to light during the investigation, jeopardizing her spot on the transplant list. As for me, I focused on rebuilding my life. I started a support group for people who had escaped manipulative family situations. It became my way of turning all that pain into something positive, helping others while finally freeing myself from the Petersons' control. At our first meeting, a woman tearfully shared, "I never thought I'd be strong enough to leave." "But you did," I reassured her, "and that's what matters." Months passed, and I was having lunch with Emma when breaking news flashed on the TV in the restaurant. The Petersons were being led out of court in handcuffs. "Holy," Emma whispered, "they're actually going to prison." I felt a swirl of emotions, relief, vindication, and a twinge of sadness for what could have been. Later that week, I got an unexpected call. It was Samantha. "Avery, it's me. I got a kidney, an anonymous donor." "That's great, Samantha. I'm happy for you," I replied, unsure of what else to say. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry, Avery, for everything. You were right about us." After a moment, I simply said, "I hope you make the most of this second chance, Samantha. Goodbye." As I hung up, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. The Petersons were finally facing justice, their reputation and finances in ruins, but most importantly, I was free. That night, I wrote in my journal, "A year ago, I thought I had the perfect life. Now I realize it was all a carefully constructed lie." But the truth, as painful as it was, set me free. I stood up for myself, exposed the lies, and walked away. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. To anyone out there facing a similar situation, remember, you're stronger than you know. Don't let anyone manipulate you into sacrificing your own well-being. Your life is yours, and you deserve to live it on your own terms. I closed the journal, proud of how far I had come. I had survived the Petersons, and now, I was thriving. That was the best revenge of all. The story of Avery and the Petersons has come to an end. Now, I have a question for you. If you were in Avery's shoes, would you have donated your kidney to Samantha, despite all the mistreatment from the Peterson family? Or do you think Avery made the right choice by prioritizing her own well-being?
Terry and Doug arrived at the orphanage just a few months apart. She was nearly 7, while he had turned 8 a month before. Terry was raised by her single mother, who suddenly passed away from a late-discovered illness. With no other relatives, Terry was immediately placed in the orphanage. Doug's story was different, but ended similarly. He was an only, long-awaited child from a prosperous family. His parents doted on him, ensuring he had everything he needed. For his birthday, they took him to a circus in a neighbouring town. The day was wonderful and filled with joy, but it ended in tragedy. On the way home, their car was hit head-on by another vehicle. Doug's parents died instantly, while he only sustained minor scratches and bruises, losing consciousness from the impact. Doug had an aunt living in the country, but she declined, citing old age, health problems and a limited pension. She visited Doug at the orphanage a few times initially, but then stopped. Terry and Doug found themselves in the same orphanage, but they didn't become friends immediately. But one day during recess, Doug noticed a few boys teasing a red-haired girl by snatching her folder of notebooks and calling her names. Without hesitation, Doug, who was the tallest among his classmates and had been involved in sports from a young age, intervened. His stature implied he could easily defend himself and others. "Hand over the folder now," he commanded the startled boys. Seeing their hesitation, he grabbed the folder from one of them and gave it back to the frightened girl. He then warned the group, "If I see or hear any more insults towards her, I'll make sure you regret it." To emphasize his point, he grabbed the apparent ringleader by the collar, shaking him while saying, "I advise against making me angry. I hope I won't have to repeat my words again." One of them promptly nodded, waved to his friends, and they all disappeared down the school corridor. Doug approached the girl. "Let's go. I'll make sure no one else hurts you. My name is Doug, and yours?" Thus began their friendship. Doug spent all his spare time with Terry, protecting her from anyone who tried to offend her. Few dared, and those who did soon learned to avoid Terry. As they grew older, their friendship evolved into a deeper, more sincere feeling. By the end of school, they couldn't imagine life without each other. Doug adored Terry, who reciprocated his love, claiming she couldn't live without him. Throughout their acquaintance, they never quarrelled. Everyone in the orphanage expected them to marry once they became adults. After graduation, they entered Terry's mother's apartment and stood breathless, hand in hand, for several minutes. Then Doug suddenly swept Terry into his arms and twirled her around the room. "We're free now," he shouted enthusiastically. Terry, laughing gleefully, playfully tapped him on the shoulder with her fists and said, "You, crazy! Calm down now." For the first few months, they lived modestly, trying to find a job. Despite unclear future prospects, their love for each other and their happiness were undiminished. The couple decided to get married later when they could save up some money. "I actually want us," Doug said, hugging Terry, "to have everything like normal people. Wedding rings, a veil for you, and a beautiful white dress. So let's wait a little, okay?" Terry was prepared to wait indefinitely to be near him, so she agreed without hesitation. After completing her studies, she quickly found work in a small store as a salesperson. However, Doug wasn't as fortunate. He would leave each morning searching for employment and return upset. Terry understood that his efforts were in vain. Comforting him, she said, "Why are you worrying, dear? Everything will be fine. You're smart and capable. You'll definitely find something. In the meantime, we can live on my income." Later, Doug began going out in the evenings and returning in the mornings. Terry felt anxious, but he reassured her. "Well, what's on your mind? I got a job as a security guard at a club on the other side of town," he said. She seemed to calm down, but she couldn't understand why the club paid different amounts each time. When Doug started bringing home mysterious bags, Terry lost sleep over it. She tried asking him about the contents, to which he casually responded, "Baby, what are you imagining? A colleague asked me to store some things. He's fixing his apartment. Let them be here. We have plenty of space." Terry chose to believe these unlikely stories, fearing the alternative. However, one day, unable to resist her curiosity, she peeked into one of the bags while Doug was out shopping. Her worst suspicions were confirmed. It contained jewellery, expensive items, watches, and a natural woman's fur coat. A wave of fear washed over Terry as she quickly shut the bag and sat in the kitchen, dazed. She knew Doug was involved in something criminal, but she didn't know how to talk to him about it. Upon returning from the store, Doug noticed Terry's distress and asked, "Honey, is something wrong? You look pale, you're shivering." Terry, rattling the dishes, was preparing dinner, and afraid to look him in the eye, quietly said, "It's all right, just a little headache." Doug gently embraced her, his tone leaving no room for objections. "You should lie down now, and I'll finish everything. I'll call you as soon as dinner is ready. Perhaps you should take a pill." Terry nodded and headed to her room, hoping to figure out how to discuss what she had seen with Doug. Deep in thought and overwrought, she didn't notice when she fell asleep. An insistent doorbell woke her, and she got up and left her room. In the hallway, Doug stood and pleaded, "Sweetheart, please don't open the door. They're here for me. I'll explain everything later." The fear in his eyes left Terry frozen in place, unsure of what to do. A harsh voice behind the door brought her back to reality. It demanded voluntary entry, threatening otherwise to break down the door. The rest felt like a dream. She opened the door to 3 policemen. They showed some papers, handcuffed Doug, and started searching. The witnesses, a couple of elderly neighbours from across, watched the scene unfold. They whispered among themselves as Terry struggled to believe that this was reality and not a nightmare. At the end of the search, one of the policemen said, "Your friend has stolen so much that there will be enough charges for both of you. Yes, young lady, you may also face a sentence for complicity as an accomplice." From that very moment in Terry's life began a real nightmare, in which she blamed Doug and did not understand how he could do such a thing without even thinking that it would hurt her. From the time the police arrived, Doug never looked at her. Only, as he was led away, he whispered, "I'm sorry, my love. I just wanted us to have money, so you'd lack nothing." One of the policemen overheard this and sneered. "Don't worry, she won't need anything for a few years. The state will provide her with meals and uniforms." Interrogations, detention, and the trial followed. It was revealed that Doug had burglarized several homes and apartments in a short space of time. He sold the stolen goods to fences and pawn shops. He stated in court, "I wanted to throw a grand wedding with a limousine and a restaurant. I also wanted a larger apartment for us to raise many children, maybe even a house, and a car, of course." Terry listened silently, tears streaming down her face. Their lawyer, only fulfilling a legal obligation, did little. Doug was sentenced to 5 years, and Terry, as an accomplice, received 2.5. Upon hearing the verdict, she broke down in tears and yelled at Doug, "I hate you! Do you hear? I hate you! You've ruined our lives!" Doug wrapped his arms around his head and swayed from side to side, as if trying to block out the scene unfolding before him. They left the courtroom without even glancing at each other. It would seem that not so long ago, the lovers had become complete strangers instantly. Terry was placed in a cell with seasoned inmates. From day one, they seized every opportunity to taunt the quiet, unassuming orphan. There were nights when fear kept her awake, convinced she would be killed or attacked. Terry couldn't fathom why they harboured such hatred, turning her life into a daily nightmare. One day, an insignificant altercation escalated into her cellmates throwing her on the floor and assaulting her. If it hadn't been for the timely arrival of the guards, her life may have ended there. Terry was taken to the medical station, where, among other things, it was discovered that she was already 3 months pregnant. After that day, the girl was transferred to a cell with quieter prisoners, who were jailed for light crimes. A few weeks before giving birth, the elderly guard advised her to apply for parole. "You have a good standing here, and you're serving your first and hopefully last sentence. You'll be having a child soon. You should consider it." Although sceptical, Terry applied for parole and immediately put it out of her mind. She had her daughter on schedule, and despite everything, felt joy when she saw her for the first time. The baby girl strongly resembled her as a child, and Terry was glad that she took after her and not her absent father. When her daughter was just over 2 months old, Terry was informed that her parole application had been approved and she was free. She was relieved that she still had her mother's apartment, which had been closed all this time. However, now she needed to find a way to support herself. And soon, the Almighty decided to help the poor woman. As she went for a walk with her daughter, she noticed an ad at the entrance of her building. "Cleaner required at nearby office." Terry immediately went to the address, realizing with her past and a child in her arms, this was the only kind of job she could get. At the personnel department, she was greeted by a young woman with kind eyes. But upon hearing her situation, she said, "I'm really sorry, but we can't hire you, not with a criminal record and a newborn baby. By the way, Why didn't you at least leave your child at home when you came here?" Barely holding back tears, Terry replied, "I have no one to leave my child with. I'm a single mother with no relatives or close friends. Please give me a chance. I can clean in the evening when no one is around. I'll put my daughter into the bed and then clean up. She's a good sleeper. I desperately need this job." The woman looked at Terry with pity and sympathy. After a moment of thought, she said, "Sit down. I'll see what I can do." She dialed a number from memory. When someone answered, she said cheerfully, "Hi, Helen, how are you? Did you mention needing a cleaner?" No, I'm not looking for a job. I know someone who needs one. May I send her over to talk to you?" "Okay, thank you." After hanging up, she wrote an address on a piece of paper and handed it to Terry. "This is the address of my friend who's in charge. Her name is Mrs. Sheridan. I don't know where you'll be able to put your child, though. I assume you don't even have a stroller?" Terry, lowering her eyes, quietly replied, "No, but I'll think of something." The woman sighed and suddenly said, "You know what? Come here today at 6. I live a couple of houses down and I'll bring you my daughter's stroller. I was going to throw it away, but it looks like it has to work for a while longer." That day seemed to Terry like the most successful one in recent times. She secured a job. The salary wasn't substantial, but she could take little Alice with her. The HR woman brought out not only a very comfortable stroller, but also 2 bags of nearly new children's clothes. Also, she invited Terry to come along on her day off, saying, "You and I are of the same build. I think I can gather some clothes for you too." Terry was immensely grateful to Holly. Without her help, the job search might have taken much longer. Now every morning she went to work with her daughter. The lack of a strict schedule was a big advantage. The main thing was to get everything done during the day. Terry would rock the baby and, leaving her in a stroller, start cleaning. Then she moved to the next floor and repeated the process. Thus, while her daughter slept, Terry managed to complete everything in 2 rounds. The boss, Mrs. Sheridan, was delighted with her new employee, and every time she met her she said, "Well, I don't know how to thank Holly for such a worker. Before you, we had many irresponsible and unreliable employees who would work for a day and disappear for a week. I was literally ready to start cleaning myself. However, I feel bad for Alice. I'll try to figure something out." A few days later, while Terry was cleaning, Mrs. Sheridan returned with good news. "I made an arrangement with an acquaintance of mine who is now a pensioner, and she agreed to look after Alice while you clean up." Looking confused, Terry replied softly, "But I won't be able to afford that. I'm barely making ends meet as it is." Mrs. Sheridan smiled again, saying, "Oh, you don't need to pay anything. Mrs. Brooks will do it out of kindness. Well, you can go to the store or pharmacy when she needs it." From then on, Terry left her daughter with Mrs. Brooks, a very kind elderly woman, when she went to work. The young woman thanked God for bringing such wonderful people into her life. They quickly found common ground, as they both had no relatives and did their best to survive. Mrs. Brooks's husband had passed away 5 years ago, a year after their only son's death. Whenever the elderly woman spoke about them, she would tear up and say, "That's how it happened. They are together now, and I'm alone here. I've been praying to God to take me to his home, but it seems it's not my time yet. So, I'll help you." Terry and her daughter began visiting Mrs. Brooks more frequently in Terry's spare time. The young woman helped around the house, cleaned, occasionally cooked, and ran errands. On sunny days, all 3 enjoyed strolling in the nearby park. Time flew by, and when little Alice turned 1.5, Mrs. Sheridan helped Terry enroll her into a nursery. Mrs. Sheridan also found Terry one more part-time job. "The job isn't tough and it pays well," she mentioned while providing the address, "but I hope you'll still work for me." "Thank you so much for everything. Of course, I will not leave you, and will always remember everything you have done for me." Now Terry was responsible for cleaning in the residential complex and in the beauty salon. She tried to forget her prison past, but the local district police officer would occasionally remind her. Whenever Terry saw the officer at her door, she knew there had been another theft or robbery in the neighborhood. Despite her efforts to explain that she had a job and a little daughter, he continued to check her. When Alice turned 6, she asked, frightened upon seeing the police officer at their door again, "Mum, why does he always come to us?" Terry kissed her daughter and replied, "He's just checking that no one is bothering us. Go to your room. I'll tell him we're fine and he'll leave." When the door closed behind her daughter, Terry whispered to the district officer, "Please, never ask your questions in front of my daughter. I don't want her to know about my past." "Sooner or later she'll find out," the man said sadly. "There are many people who talk. It would be better if you tell her where she was born and how you got there." Seemingly apologetic, he added, "Terry, I'm sorry to disturb you. I see you're working tirelessly to ensure your daughter lacks nothing. But it's my job. I must visit people with a past like yours first." She understood everything perfectly well. After answering all the questions, she escorted the policeman to the door. Once he was gone, Alice ran out into the hallway. "Mummy, let's go quickly," the little girl shouted excitedly. "There's a swimming competition." Ever since she was about 3 years old, Alice was glued to the TV whenever swimmers were performing. After every broadcast, she would look at her mother with hopeful eyes and say, "Mummy, when will you enroll me in swimming? I will perform beautifully, and you will be proud of me." Terry always promised her in response, but never kept her promise. But one day, Alice, with tears in her eyes, asked, "Mum, why do you always promise? I really want to swim, and you just keep saying, 'Okay, we'll go there,' but nothing doesn't change." That day, her daughter cried so bitterly that Terry decided she would fulfill her promise no matter what. In the morning, after taking her daughter to the school, she went to the swimming pool. It was just one bus stop away from their house, and she quickly reached the beautiful sports complex. But when she found out how much lessons cost, Terry was upset, but she paid for 1 month. It was the amount of money that Terry could put aside for the last 2 months of work. She intended to spend it on buying new boots to replace the tattered ones she was wearing now, but she couldn't let Alice down. After work, she bought a swimming cap and a swimsuit for her daughter from a second-hand shop. In the evening, during dinner, Terry shared the news. Alice was overcome with disbelief and excitement, and she asked in a shaky voice, "Is it true? Will I swim?" Terry hugged her daughter, gave her a kiss and replied, "Of course, my good girl. You'll be the best swimmer, I'm sure of it." Terry couldn't bear to tell her daughter that her happiness would be short-lived, lasting only a month, because they could no longer afford these lessons. But the poor woman decided to give her daughter at least a little joy. Alice eagerly anticipated her first class. The entire evening prior, she paraded around the apartment in her swimsuit, and Terry even asked with amusement, "Are you planning to sleep in that outfit tonight?" Saturday morning arrived, and Terry accompanied her daughter to the pool. Alice was looking around with bright, excited eyes, clutching her mother's hand tightly. The young coach instructed parents to observe from the benches along the walls. After placing her daughter under the coach's supervision, Terry moved aside. Seeing the well-dressed mothers, it was clear that Terry was the only one who had spent her last money on these lessons. The others were evidently well off. However, noting the coach treated each child equally, Terry felt reassured. But merely 5 minutes into the class, 3 girls began to disrupt proceedings. Despite the coach's patient attempts to discipline them, the girls continued to speak loudly and point at Alice. "What are you doing here? "Where did you find that outfit? In a trash heap?" one of them asked, laughing uproariously. "You look like a turtle from the swamp," echoed his friend. One of the mothers turned to Terry with a grimace, saying through clenched teeth, "They let just anyone in. I hope your daughter doesn't infect our children with anything. Does she even have a medical certificate?" Terry chose to ignore this. She was willing to endure anything for her daughter to swim. The coach couldn't hear the mothers of the children. They were on the other side of the pool, but he tried to discipline the girls. But he did it very hesitantly and only once. He was well aware of whom these girls' fathers were, prominent businessmen in the city with extensive connections, and the girls' mothers were known for their fiery tempers. If the coach truly tried to discipline these young troublemakers, he'd quickly find himself jobless, a prospect he clearly wanted to avoid. Noticing that the rich girls kept insulting Alice, and that she had tears in her eyes, Terry got up and walked over to the parents who were standing by the water. She had already realized that poor people like her were assigned specific spots away from the pool, while the affluent were entitled to move around freely, closely monitoring their children's progress from the water's edge. Terry, maintaining her composure and articulating each word clearly, said, "I ask you to calm your children down right now." The two ladies with manicures and artificial eyelashes exchanged glances and laughed loudly by the pool. "Did you hear that?" one of them began, seemingly ignoring Terry. "Is this country bumpkin threatening us? I don't understand how she got here. I should lodge a complaint. I'm not letting my daughter share a group with this poor beggar." In the next moment, before anyone could react, Terry lunged at these rude women and pushed them into the pool. Silence followed for a second, and then chaos began. The scandalized women screamed hoarse that they could not swim and tried to get out of the water by grabbing the edges of the pool. The children watched in stunned silence. The coach, dressed fully, rushed to their aid and helped the women to get out of the pool. The once haughty, well-dressed ladies now resembled shapeless wet toads. Their blouses, clinging to their bodies, revealed their far-from-perfect figures. Once on dry land, instead of expressing gratitude, they immediately started berating the coach. Already at the exit, one of the rescued yelled, "If you can't train normal children, then get out of here. You're certainly fired. I'll go to the director right now, and you can pack your bags." Terry looked at her frightened daughter, regretting that her first class had ended before it even started. She managed to convince the girl to change her clothes and head home, promising they would return someday. Upon exiting the sports centre, Terry instantly noticed the coach sitting on a nearby bench. It was clear the management had given in to complaints and laid him off. Seeing his distress, Terry decided to offer her support. "Please forgive me," she reassured him. "I never anticipated this outcome, but I couldn't let my daughter be mistreated. I'm sure you'll find another job." Mike responded with a sorrowful expression. "I understand. But how is it my fault? I always treated all the children equally and avoided conflicts, yet here I am. I even risked myself to save those women, and I was laid off in gratitude." They conversed for a while. Alice played on a nearby playground. As they prepared to leave, Mike offered to escort them home. They continued chatting at the entrance of the apartment building, and at that moment Terry found herself reluctant to part ways with Mike, and he seemingly sensed her feelings. "Shall we go for a walk all together tomorrow? We could visit the park or go to the movies," he proposed. When Terry explained that she had to work, he suggested meeting after she finished. Terry was ashamed to admit who and where she was working, and she offered to meet near the school Alice attended. Soon their meetings became a regular occurrence, and soon Terry knew He was the type of man she wanted in her life. Mike was caring, intelligent, and polite. A few weeks into their meetings, Terry decided to invite Mike over. She resolved to reveal her past and present that evening, as living a lie was proving too difficult, and she knew the truth would eventually surface. Starting the conversation was difficult, but Terry finally said, "Mike, I enjoy your company. I feel comfortable and happy around you, but I need to be honest about my life. I misled you. I'm not a saleswoman. I wish I could be, but my past restricts me to the role of a cleaner." She lowered her gaze, fearful of Mike's reaction as she confessed everything. He listened in silence, not uttering a word. When she finished, he rose and simply held her, whispering, "My little fool, did you really think I'd just up and leave like that? I don't care what happened before. What matters is that I have you now. I want to be by your side always, my girls." Terry snuggled into his chest, feeling relieved for the first time in years. That same night, Mike revealed that he had been married for 2 years, only to experience a tragic loss. His wife was hit by a drunk driver while she was 3 months pregnant. "That's how I was widowed before I could be a real husband and become a father." Mike finished his story with a sad note. The next morning, they awoke in each other's arms for the first time, vowing never to part again. A few weeks later, Mike found a new job and persuaded Terry and her daughter to move in with him. He then convinced Terry to quit one of her jobs. "I earn well. We have enough. Washing entrances is tough work, which I don't want my beloved to do," Mike said seriously. "If you want to maintain some independence, you can continue cleaning the beauty salon. But you know, I don't like it." Despite her happiness, Terry was still hesitant, feeling that if anything happened, she wouldn't be able to find employment again. So she decided to continue working at the beauty parlor. Looking at the relationship between Mike and Alice, Terry often thought that he was the kind of father she had always wished for her daughter. Mike was always concerned about Alice's well-being, and would even rush to the pharmacy in the middle of the night for her medication when she was sick. As summer began, Mike recalled Alice's aspiration to learn to swim and decided to teach her. "Every weekend, we'll visit the river," Mike cheerfully announced at dinner. "I know of a wonderful spot where the current isn't too strong. It's even a better place to learn to swim than in a pool." Alice's joy knew no bounds. She hugged Mike tightly and whispered, "You're the best. I wish you were my dad." "Alice, what are you saying?" Terry tried to interrupt. Mike placed Alice on his lap, smiled and said, "Why not? I'd be delighted. But we should ask your mum if she'd like someone like me to be your dad." Terry smiled. "Yes, I would like that very much." "Well, that's good. Tomorrow we'll apply for the marriage. But for now, let's go to bed. It's late," Mike concluded to everyone's pleasure. The next morning, Mike pleaded with the stern lady at the registry office to expedite their application, but she was unyielding, firmly stating that the laws and rules applied to everyone. Thus the earliest available date was a month and 3 days later. Stepping outside, Mike hugged Terry and said with a smile, "It's okay, this won't change anything. A month will fly by before you know it. The main thing is that God gave you to me. All thanks to you and Alice going to that damn pool." Meanwhile, as it turned out, the scandal at the pool left its mark. The antics of the rich, arrogant women were captured on the sports complex's security cameras. Likely, one of the guards recorded the most dramatic moments from the start of the scandal. The video spread across the internet, and within a few days it was everywhere. The rich women were now recognized on the streets, their fashionable, loose clothing and heavy makeup no longer hiding their true selves. The angry ladies decided to seek revenge on the pool coach and the beggar who had pushed them into the pool. They sought them both out and were immensely surprised to find the perpetrators of their disgrace living in happiness and absorbed in wedding preparations. Although they decided not to organize a lavish celebration, an evening for loved ones was still planned. Mike had lost both of his parents while he was in the second year of college. His mother had passed away from a serious illness, and his father, unable to cope with the loss and loneliness, had died in his sleep 6 months later. Mike only had one relative remaining, an uncle who lived in another state and with whom he maintained contact. He decided to invite them, along with a few of his school friends, to the wedding. Terry, on the other hand, wanted to invite Holly and Mrs. Sheridan, who had supported her during difficult times. She also wanted to invite Mrs. Brooks, who had become a part of her family. A small cosy cafe was booked and rings were purchased. The only thing left was to choose the outfits. Over the weekend, Terry was ready to buy a dress, but hesitated and asked Mike, "Honey, can I go alone? They say it's bad luck if the groom sees the bride's dress before the wedding." The man laughed and replied, "You're my superstitious one. As you wish. We'll go to the river with Alice. After all, summer is ending soon and we have plans." Terry quickly chose an outfit. It was a cream dress with a lace bodice embroidered with beads. She chose a similarly coloured dress for Alice with a multi-layered puffy skirt. Returning home, satisfied and happy, Terry began preparing dinner while humming a tune she'd heard somewhere. Suddenly the phone rang. She picked up the receiver, listened to the caller in silence, then excitedly responded, "I'll be right there. What's the address?" She quickly gathered herself, her mind in turmoil. Terry couldn't believe what she had been told. A policeman had reported finding her daughter Alice alone and crying on the riverbank. Hailing a cab, Terry quickly arrived at the station, where her terrified daughter rushed into her arms, sobbing. "Mummy, Mike drowned!" Alice cried. "I looked away for just a moment to pick some flowers for you. When I came back, he was gone. All that was left were his sneakers and clothes on the shore." Alice sobbed uncontrollably, and Terry began to soothe her. "Oh, honey, how could Mike drown? He's a swimming coach." With these words, she tried to comfort not only her daughter, but also herself. She wanted to believe it was impossible, but the policeman said the evidence was irrefutable. Mike was gone. On the drive home, Terry tried to hide her own emotions from Alice. "Mummy, don't cry," Alice said, stroking her mother's hair. "I'm here for you. I'll always care for you and love you, just like Mike did." Her daughter's words made her calm down. During the day, Terry mechanically went to work while her daughter was at school. She would pick her up later and they'd go home. Only when her daughter Alice was asleep did Terry allow herself to cry. One evening, Terry had a vivid dream. Her missing fiancé was alive and unhurt, sitting in a tiny, windowless, stone-walled room that resembled a barn or cellar. The cold and dampness felt so real that she pulled the blanket over her head in her sleep. Mike seemed to be calling for help, but she could barely comprehend his words. Awakening in a cold sweat, Terry wanted to forget the nightmare. However, the dream was so real that she decided to report it to the police. When Terry shared her suspicions, the duty officer, clearly annoyed by her visit, asked whether Mike had any enemies or anyone with whom he had quarrelled. Terry remembered a recent incident that Mike had told her about. He had recently confronted that arrogant woman at the pool. She had called him names and seemed ready to attack him, and Mike's smirk had only made her angrier. Terry shared the pool incident and the woman's threats of revenge with the officer, but it was clear that he had no interest in dealing with this matter. Engaging in the quarrels of well-known businessmen and their wives was a surefire way to invite trouble. Under normal circumstances, he would have relegated this case to a distant draw, but this time Terry was fortunate. Glancing the grey-haired man seated at a nearby table, the officer accepted her application. As it happened, there was an ongoing audit in the department, which compelled the police officer to respond properly to her visit. Then all parties involved in the old conflict were investigated. All properties owned by the families were taken into account, and finally, in one of the country houses, the police discovered a cellar where they found Mike. Thin and covered in stubble, he could barely stand. The house owner tried to justify himself to the police. "I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to teach him a lesson. I have nothing against him personally, but when my wife saw the video of him falling into the water on the internet, every day she nagged me to find him and teach him a lesson. You know how relentless a woman can be once she latches onto an idea? I promise I'll make amends and compensate. Please relay my message to the victims." The wealthy businessman paid a substantial amount for emotional distress and vowed never to interfere in the couple's life again. Upon returning home, Mike mentioned to Terry that the businessmen were discussing an online video clip. They quickly found and watched the video, laughing heartily at its contents. "Yes, you're a true person's heroine," Mike affectionately exclaimed, kissing his beloved. "Look at all these comments. I bet about 90% of people are awed by your bravery. They're probably relieved that someone finally put those who thought they were above everyone else in their place." Upon discovering Terry's newfound fame, a makeup artist from the salon where Terry worked suggested starting a blog. She even assisted in bringing the idea to life. Soon, Terry's blog attracted a vast number of followers who were interested in her life. She received advertising contract offers from 2 companies. After leaving her job, she dedicated herself fully to her new hobby, which generated a substantial income. Mike was thrilled about his bride's infatuation, but the only thing he didn't really like was that because of her busy schedule, she could not find the time to go with him to the registry office and to finally become a wife and a husband. Because of that incident with the rich people, they didn't show up for the ceremony on the scheduled date last time, and Mike had already suggested several times to apply again. "Don't you want to get married anymore?" he asked his beloved once. "Of course I do," Terry replied tenderly, kissing him and wrapping her arms around his neck. "I love you dearly, and we will definitely get married. But let's do it a little later when I have more time. We are together, and that's what matters most." Mike didn't bring up the topic again. Life continued as usual. One day, after taking Alice to school, Terry returned home to write a new post and contact advertisers. As she approached the entrance, she noticed a familiar silhouette. The man also recognized her and waved cheerfully. However, Terry felt no joy at this encounter. "Didn't expect to see me, did you?" Doug smirked. "I thought I'd never see you again, and then I came across a familiar face online. I missed you." He reached out to touch her face, but Terry recoiled and pushed his hand away. "Why are you here? What do you want? I don't owe you anything," she asked sharply, and was about to leave, but Doug, who had just been released from the jail, grabbed her wrist sharply. Holding her hand tightly, the man hissed, "I don't think so. I saw a little girl in one of your videos, and you were speaking about her as if she's your daughter. I did the math and figured out she's mine. Isn't she?" Terry attempted to free her arm, but the ex-convict wrapped both arms around her waist, pulling her close. He whispered in her ear, "You won't escape from me that easily. My daughter. Either you pay me off, or I'll visit her every day." At that moment, Mike suddenly appeared and, looking confused, asked, "What's going on, Terry? Can you explain?" The woman pushed Doug away and started explaining who he was and what he wanted. But interrupting her, Doug suggested, "Why don't we move this conversation to your house? I assume you wouldn't want the neighbours to witness this scene and potentially post it online," he said wryly. Terry tried to drive the intruder away, but Mike interjected menacingly. "Why not? I hope to learn something interesting that I didn't know about your relationship." From the moment Doug entered the apartment, he began to act arrogantly, asserting that he should be treated as an honoured guest because he is Alice's biological father. When he left that evening, he claimed that he would regularly visit Alice, which disrupted the peaceful atmosphere in their home. Tension arose between Mike and Terry, like a black cat crossing their path. Despite Terry's explanations, Mike became distant, transforming from a cheerful, loving man to someone withdrawn and lost in his thoughts. He began drinking at a bar almost every evening, and Terry was unsure how to salvage their relationship. She tried talking, pleading, explaining, and even arranged a romantic dinner. And then one night, Mike did not come home. Terry had been calling him all the night, but he didn't answer. Fearing that something had happened to him again, Terry went to his workplace the next morning. Seeing Mike unharmed, she immediately tried to talk. "Honey, where did you spend the night? I was worried sick." The man interrupted her mid-sentence, stating, "I'm not coming home again. Now that the girl has a father, you two should raise her together. I'm not rushing you, but I suggest you return to your apartment and start building a new relationship with him." With these words, he turned away, showing that the conversation was over. Terry was shocked, but she also realized that she had to resolve the issue with Doug first. It was clear that he intended to get financial compensation in exchange for his agreement not to interfere in her life. However, she also knew that if the victim starts paying, she continues to do so for the rest of her life. In the end, Terry decided to solve the issue with Doug strictly through legal means. But to her great surprise and relief, it turned out to be unnecessary. It appeared that Doug had not learned from his years in prison and had returned to his old ways. Predictably, he was soon caught by law enforcement and received an even longer sentence. Terry sighed with relief. While she felt sorry for Doug, she knew he had chosen his path by himself. A week later, Mike returned. He entered the apartment timidly, holding a bouquet of flowers. "I'm sorry, Terry. I've been a fool. Jealousy almost drove me crazy. I thought you still loved him, especially since he's your child's father. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I've felt terrible these past few weeks without you. I missed you and tried to numb it with alcohol." Terry remained silent, nestled into his chest, afraid to pull away. Mike, pulling back slightly, took her face in his hand and kissed her. A month later, they finally married. Terry wore the same cream dress she had bought for their first unsuccessful celebration. As the champagne was poured, she covered her glass with her hand and requested juice from her husband. "Beloved, don't you want to toast our finally accomplished wedding?" Mike asked in surprise. She smiled mysteriously and replied, "I think it wouldn't be good for our baby boy or girl." Taking his wife's hands in his own, Mike, his voice trembling with excitement, asked, "Is it true? We're having a baby?" "And I want a little sister," Alice exclaimed, running to the newlyweds and hugging them both. That day, everyone radiated joy, realizing a new, happier life was about to begin. Nancy's husband Patrick was 15 years her senior. She didn't want to marry him, but her parents insisted. "What is a woman's purpose?" Nancy's mother, Rebecca, had indoctrinated her since childhood. To bear children and obey her husband. Arguing with her mother was futile and only made matters worse, but Nancy tried. "What if I don't want to get married? I'm only 15, she protested. Rebecca sighed. "I'm not suggesting you should marry now. When you turn 18, your father and I will decide whom you should marry." "And what if I don't want to marry at 18? What if I want to study, work, become a programmer or an architect or start my own business," Nancy retorted, earning a smack for her audacity. It wasn't particularly painful, but it was hurtful and humiliating. "Where did you get such absurd ideas? An architect? Ridiculous! Who would hire a woman?" Her mother sternly rebuked her. "A woman's place is to keep her home orderly and raise her children." "But you work yourself," Nancy countered, fighting back tears. Rebecca sighed again. "I only work because there's no place in our village where your father could earn a decent wage." Nancy's father was a school bus driver. Each day he transported children from neighbouring villages to school and back. His job was considered respectable in their community, and his consistent pay was a bonus. However, his salary was insufficient for Nancy's mother to be a stay-at-home mum. So, Rebecca worked as a saleswoman in the local store, a job she didn't enjoy. Her moods often reflected her interactions with customers, and since the store was the only one in the village, locals had to tolerate her occasional rudeness. Rebecca's only source of happiness and hope was her daughter. Her dream was to marry her daughter off to a wealthy man, thinking it might benefit her too. Nancy was a beautiful girl, with long, thick, golden hair and big black eyes framed by fluffy eyelashes. And she met her future husband Patrick before she turned 18. On the day they met, she and her mother were in the city to buy a graduation dress. "How quickly you grow up," sighed Rebecca, sorting through the outfits. Though simple, the dresses looked stunning on Nancy and enhanced her natural beauty. "Well, you look wonderful. Everything suits your face. You could take all of these outfits," the saleswoman complimented. She was a short, plump woman in her 40s with a ruddy complexion. Obediently, Nancy tried on one outfit after another, twirling in front of the mirror for her mother's approval. She was indifferent about what to wear to the prom. Firstly, her mother would insist on buying what she preferred. Secondly, her parents had rejected her plea to continue her studies. They had already compiled a list of potential suitors and planned to address this matter seriously once Nancy graduated. "Prom?" A pleasant male voice suddenly sounded near them. Nancy turned around. In the light blue, knee-length dress she was trying on, she felt subconscious under the stranger's scrutinizing gaze. He was tall and towered over her. His broad shoulders, firm chin and straight black eyebrows gave him an air of confidence and strength. His black eyes, even darker than Nancy's, bore into her. Nancy also noticed how the saleswoman's demeanour changed when she saw the stranger. She tensed up and started to smile ingratiatingly. "Yes, we're going to the prom," Rebecca answered for her daughter. "How do you like the dress? Does it suit my daughter?" Nancy felt uneasy that her mother was seeking the opinion of a stranger, who was unabashedly staring at her. However, the man did not seem surprised by Rebecca's question. He examined Nancy once again, from head to toe, and shook his head in disapproval. "I think we can offer you a better solution, Sarah. Come here." He gestured slightly, and a saleswoman immediately approached him. The stranger whispered something to her, and she nodded vigorously. "Of course, Mr. Woods. It'll be here in a minute," she said, and hurried into the back room. "What's your name?" The man looked directly at Nancy, making her feel like a rabbit cornered by a boa constrictor. "Nancy," she responded softly. "And how old are you?" 17. "She'll be 18 in 3 weeks, at the end of May," Rebecca interjected for some reason. The stranger nodded, as if this information was somehow useful to him. He then shifted his gaze to Rebecca. "You're not from around here?" The mother shook her head vigorously. "No, we are from a village in the suburbs," answered the mother. What a peculiar quality he has, Nancy thought. Why did mother and the saleswoman suddenly start behaving so subserviently? Just then Sarah returned, panting, with a black case in her hands. "Here, Mr. Woods, I got it," she said cheerfully, but not naturally to Nancy, nodding towards the dressing room. Nancy noticed Mr. Woods and her mother watching her expectantly too. It seemed she had no other choice. Upon seeing the dress, Nancy immediately realized that it was far superior to the ones she had tried on earlier. The fabric, tailoring, even the smell suggested it was at least 10 times more expensive. As Nancy stepped out of the dressing room, she heard her mother gasp in delight. Yes, the dress was a dream. Made of smooth red silk, it fitted snugly and fell almost to the floor, flaring out like a blooming flower. The narrow straps accentuated the girl's shoulders and collarbones without being provocative. Nancy thought any movie star or royalty would be proud to wear such a dress. The slit to mid-thigh showcased her long, slender legs, but could easily be concealed within the numerous fabric folds if needed. This must be worth as much as my parents earn in 2 months, Nancy thought, slowly turning in front of the mirror. She was caught between admiration for her own beauty and youth, the realization that this dress was perfect for her, and an unexplainable fear. "How much is it?" Rebecca asked. She seemed to understand that this was not an ordinary dress. Sarah was about to answer, but Mr. Wood stopped her with a hand gesture. "It's a gift," he replied, "provided you invite me to the prom." "Oh, of course," Rebecca replied hastily, seemingly in disbelief. The man nodded, seemingly confident in her response. He then turned to the saleswoman. "Sarah, let's pick out some shoes." The saleswoman quickly produced a white rectangular box containing black sandals with a low heel and elegantly intertwined straps. Mr. Woods took the shoes from her and approached Nancy. "May I?" he asked, looking at her from head to toe. Nancy nodded, her head spinning. He squatted in front of her, maintaining an air of majesty and masculinity, and slowly replaced Nancy's old, worn ballet shoes with the black sandals. "What a beauty!" Rebecca exclaimed, mesmerized. "Of course, these are a gift too," Mr. Woods added. 15 minutes later, Nancy emerged from the store, clutching 2 large bags containing a dress and shoes. Her mother and Mr. Woods remained inside discussing the details of her upcoming graduation party. "I've just been sold," Nancy thought to herself. "I've really been sold." She was terrified that Mr. Woods might show up at their house soon, perhaps even before the graduation party, but fortunately he didn't. Nancy tried to convince herself that it was all just a bad dream, or at the very least, a gift from a stranger that she wouldn't owe anything for. But every time she looked at the dress hanging next to her bed, she realized that no one would give her such a gift without expecting something in return. Nancy had always looked forward to her graduation party, thinking it would be a turning point in her life. She had imagined that she would immediately become an adult, capable of making her own decisions. She dreamt of moving to the city, attending college, and not getting married as her parents wished. But now she realized that her dreams wouldn't come true. Her 18th birthday, which she had been eagerly anticipating, had transformed from a celebration into a sentence. When Nancy tried to discuss her feelings with her mother, she dismissed her concerns. "What's the big deal?" her mother replied, avoiding eye contact. "A nice man gave you an expensive gift, and all he wants in return is for you to attend your graduation. What's wrong with that?" "I think you want me to marry him," Nancy said bluntly. "Maybe I do. What's wrong with that? He's handsome, respected, wealthy, and the only one truly deserving of you." "Mum," Nancy cried out in despair, "I don't even know him." Rebecca slammed her fist on the table. "Enough with your hysteria!" she shouted at her daughter. "I didn't know your father when I married him either, and look at us. We've been together for years. You're such a beauty, yet you're being picky." Tears streamed down Nancy's face. "I don't want to get married," she whispered desperately. Suddenly, Rebecca decided to change tactics. She gently embraced her daughter and awkwardly stroked her blonde hair. "I'm not suggesting you rush to the registry office with him tomorrow," Rebecca said. "Just give him a chance. Get to know him better. Chat with him after graduation. You might fall in love with him, and if he turns out to be a bad man, we won't let him have you." Nancy sobbed. She wasn't sure whether she could completely trust her mother, but her words were soothing. Eventually, the long-awaited graduation day arrived at their small school. The celebration was modest compared to those in the city. They gathered in the assembly hall, where all the graduates, numbering more than 3 dozen, were brought onto the stage. Then began a series of congratulatory speeches from the principal, teachers, and parents' committee. The graduates smiled awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. The boys were uncomfortable in their new shoes, while the girls struggled to stand in high heels. Nancy's dress and shoes were the centre of attention. All the girls had tried their best for this day, but her outfit stood out. The girls looked at Nancy with envy and admiration, while the boys looked on with adoration and a sense of her being unattainable. It was clear that a simple country boy could not win over a girl in such a dress. The formal part of the ceremony concluded, and the graduates descended from the stage to join their tearful families for photos. Nancy approached her family. Tearful grandparents embraced their granddaughter, remarking on her beauty and wishing her happiness. Her father kissed her cheek, hugged her, and murmured something. The girl had only one look at her mother to realize how she was burning with impatience. Nancy's heart trembled. Something is about to happen, she thought with a sense of dread. "Congratulations!" A voice sounded behind her. She recognized it instantly, even though she had only heard it once before. Nancy turned around. Patrick Woods stood before her in a flawless black suit and a snow-white shirt, offering her a bouquet of white lilies. It felt as if everyone in the room was looking at her. "Thank you," she responded, accepting the bouquet. "You look absolutely stunning," Patrick complimented. "Thank you. All thanks to your dress and shoes," her mother interjected. "They only emphasized what was already flawless," Patrick replied. All this time he did not take his eyes off Nancy. She was scared, yet a new feeling of excitement and pride emerged. He chose her from everyone else, and now everyone was looking at her, standing in the most beautiful dress in the world. Patrick and Nancy's wedding took place on the last day of summer. Patrick covered all the expenses. The celebration was held in a luxurious restaurant, likely the biggest in the city. Nancy was awed by its beauty and grandeur. Her parents stood by, stunned. Rebecca looked around the luxurious hall, seemingly unable to believe what she was seeing. Nancy sat next to her husband, trying to understand her feelings. Everything had happened too quickly. Just a few hours ago, she had met Patrick's relatives. All the men in his family resembled him, tall, sturdy, with black eyes and dark hair. The women were alike, only more graceful. It struck her that Patrick's family wasn't surprised by the quick wedding, nor were they bothered by not knowing the bride. Nancy sat in her stunning white lace dress, afraid to move. Everyone came up to them, saying congratulations and wishing happiness and prosperity. Nancy smiled, accepted their good wishes, and felt like a beautifully adorned doll or puppet placed here to fulfill a certain role. The role of a beautiful bride, the role of a young wife. She was a girl who could be dressed up in an expensive, luxurious wedding dress and shown off to everyone. Look at her. But what is she like? Who is she? No one had asked her this question, not even Patrick. He seemed to have simply bought her from his parents. He saw her and claimed her, as one might a coveted item in a shop window. Nancy then realized that she didn't even know what kind of man her husband was. Yes, he had a certain intimidating allure. She noticed how other women gazed at him with awe and admiration, even during their wedding, their eyes filled with envy. Nancy understood that he was a catch in every sense: handsome, strong, intelligent, wealthy. But these were just qualities listed off. She didn't know who the man behind these words truly was. Patrick took her to his apartment, which was nothing like the small village house Nancy had lived in all her life. Everything in this new home frightened her. She was scared to touch anything, fearing she might break something. She suddenly felt like a terrified little girl, which in reality she was. A week later, her husband said, "Stop behaving like a guest in this house. You are the mistress here, and everything here will be as you wish." After these words, Nancy felt better. She had learned how to cook and clean, and she had now begun to use these skills. She didn't have much else to do, as she was just a wife and a homemaker. Nancy had no friends in the city, her parents were far away, and she didn't even apply to college. She once thought while standing near the stove and stirring a pot of borscht, "Is this really the life my mother imagined for me? Will my life only consist of this?" Days, weeks, and months passed, and nothing in Nancy's life changed. She settled more comfortably into the house and managed her duties as a homemaker and young wife more effectively. But she was very lonely, despite frequently having guests. Her husband Patrick's business associates, his parents, and his older brother Stupa. Her parents also visited every few months. Rebecca thoroughly enjoyed every minute spent in her son-in-law's apartment. She never tired of telling her husband, "Look at this beauty. Our daughter is so lucky." Nancy's father used to nod silently. Unlike her mother, he didn't express pleasure or dissatisfaction, but simply took everything as a given. Nancy also suspected that Patrick was giving her mother money, and likely a significant sum, as Rebecca left looking even happier than the day she had arrived to her daughter. At times, Nancy would wonder why Patrick had married her. He had made this decision after their first meeting, before he even had time to get to know her. He didn't spend much time with her, and although she wanted to confront him about it, something always stopped her. Patrick didn't show her any kind of passion or lofty love, at least not like the kind Nancy had seen in movies or read about in books. In fact, it seemed he viewed her as a functional unit, a high-quality item that he needed to maintain his status. At first, Nancy didn't fully understand his business. Later she realized that the shopping centre where they met was owned by Patrick, or rather, it had been owned by his father before he transferred it to his son. Patrick occasionally mentioned a machine shop, cafe, pawn shop, and funeral parlour, all seemingly owned by him and his family. And being such a successful businessman, Patrick needed to live up to his status. He had a nice car, watch, shoes, phone, and now he got a wife who was young, beautiful, economical, and intelligent enough to accompany him to business meetings. 2 years after their wedding, Patrick announced, "We'll be moving to a new house soon." "A new house? Where?" Nancy asked, surprised. "Not far, in the next city. More specifically, outside of it," Patrick replied. "But why should we move?" "Why not? My business is expanding, and it'll be more convenient to manage it from there. And by the way, there shouldn't be any problem for you, since you're at home most of the time." "That's what I wanted to discuss with you," Nancy interjected. "Don't worry, you'll have plenty to do there. It's a large house that needs fixing up. Besides," Patrick added, hugging her and kissing her cheek, "it's time to think about having children." "But I'm only 20, Nancy countered. "So what? We've been married for 2 years already. My mum gave birth at 19. I don't even have an education." Patrick smiled. "And why do you need it?" "What do you mean?" The husband sighed. "Nancy, people get an education to get a job. You don't need to work." She looked embarrassed. "But that's now. Maybe later I'll want to work." Patrick laughed. He sat down on the sofa and drew his wife to him. "Sweetheart, what are you talking about? You've been living a dream for 2 years.
a life that all women wish for. We're about to move to a new house, and then you'll have a child, and you will raise him or her."
Nancy realised her husband had a point. Should she complain? Did any of her classmates live in such a lavish house? Most of them remained in the village, destined to spend their lives there. They would marry classmates who might eventually become abusive husbands. Those who managed to escape the village now live in dormitories, working tirelessly to support themselves in the city. They'll likely do that for the rest of their lives. "Of course you're right," replied Nancy, "but I'd like to do something else besides stay at home."
"Don't I forbid you? Once we move, you can do whatever you want."
"Okay," replied Nancy, suddenly realising that she didn't know what she wanted to do. The issue was resolved after the couple moved to a new house. The neighbouring city was further than Nancy had anticipated, and the house was not in the city, but in a settlement an hour's drive away. Public transportation was almost impossible to use. Nancy didn't know how to drive, so when her husband was away, she was virtually confined to her new home. Besides, Nancy and Patrick seldom ventured into the city, only for occasional meetings with his partners. Nancy devoted all her spare time to organising the new house, with Patrick providing unlimited funds.
"Order anything you want on the internet," he said. "They'll deliver everything."
So Nancy spent her days choosing finishes, furniture, chandeliers, wallpaper, and so on. Although she knew little about it, she seemed to manage quite well.
"You have excellent taste,"
Patrick told her once, seeing the results of her work. "Thank you."
"Yes, the house is transformed," he said, approaching his wife and giving her a kiss. "You're a natural wife and hostess. All that's left is to become a mother."
However, it took another 2 years before Nancy became pregnant. She couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the 2 stripes. It felt as if life split into before and after. She wouldn't be alone anymore. There would now be someone in the house who would always be with her, someone to lighten her loneliness, because Nancy felt very lonely. She had been married for 4 years, yet she still couldn't understand her husband. Especially lately, Patrick always seemed to be busy. Nancy understood that her husband's work was his top priority, but she yearned for him to spend time with her, which hardly happened. She hoped their child would fill this void. As for Patrick, he was thrilled when he found out about the pregnancy. "Finally," he exclaimed, "I'm going to have a son." Nancy chuckled. "What if it's a girl?"
"No, it has to be a boy. My heir."
However, they ended up having a daughter, Bonnie. Patrick was happy, but Nancy could tell that he would have been even more excited if he had a son. After Bonnie's birth, Patrick's life remained mostly unchanged. He still spent most of his time at work, while Nancy was left to care for their daughter, always worried she might do something wrong and feel utterly exhausted. Things became slightly easier when her parents came to stay for a few weeks. She hadn't seen them for over a year and was thrilled when they'd visited her. "My girl, how you've grown!" exclaimed Rebecca. "And what a wonderful house you have." Her father approached Nancy, giving her a hug and a kiss.
"And who is this little one we have here?"
Rebecca asked gently, looking at Bonnie lying in the cradle.
"She looks a lot like you,"
added the grandfather. Nancy felt more at ease with her parents around, less lonely, although she didn't dare to express her true feelings because she didn't want to dampen their happiness. Rebecca was thrilled when she learned that her daughter had furnished the house. "You're very talented, my girl," she said. "It's very cosy and beautiful here."
"Simply fabulous," Dad added. "How wonderful that you live in such a beautiful place."
"You're lucky to have such a good husband," Rebecca sighed. Nancy nodded. "That's true, but sometimes I feel lonely here." "You're not alone now," her mother replied. "Believe me, you can't get bored with a small child, and if you do, you can always have another one."
"And a third," the father joyfully added, and they all laughed.
A cold chill ran down Nancy's spine.
She loved Bonnie more than life itself, and had accepted her fate next to Patrick. But was she destined to only be a wife and mother, trapped in this beautiful house? What would become of her once the children grew up and left? Patrick would still be a businessman, the head of the family, and she? Just an empty shell. A few days after celebrating Bonnie's 2nd birthday, Patrick announced, "By the way, soon you and your daughter will have some company." Nancy and Bonnie were sitting on a mat, with Bonnie playing with cubes, stacking them on top of one another. "What kind of company?" Nancy asked. "My good friend bought a house in the neighbourhood and will be moving here with his wife and child in a week," Patrick replied. "That sounds great!" exclaimed Nancy. "It's about time our daughter met other kids." "They have a son, the same age as Bonnie," Patrick added with a change in his voice tone. Nancy squirmed, aware that Patrick wanted a son. He had often suggested having another child, but she wasn't ready yet. The only thing constraining Patrick was a doctor's advice, recommending Nancy to wait a few more years before having another child. "Are they visiting us?" Nancy asked. "No, they invited us to their housewarming party," Patrick responded. On the designated day and at the exact time, their family was already at the neighbouring house. Nancy noticed that their neighbour's house was as large as theirs. A smiling woman in a shiny evening dress opened the door. Seeing her, Nancy regretted her simple attire of black jeans and a white t-shirt, having thought it was just a casual visit to the neighbours, not a social gathering. "Hello," the young landlady shouted cheerfully. "Come on in." She appeared to be a little older than Nancy, slender, tall, with long red hair and blue eyes. It seemed she was more comfortable in public than at home. However, Nancy hoped they could still be friends. The house was large, spacious and luxuriously furnished, a little too much for Nancy's taste. "My husband will be here soon." Then she slapped her forehead with her palm. "I'm so absent-minded. I didn't even introduce myself. I'm Joyce." Nancy nodded and smiled. "Nancy, nice to meet you." "And this must be Bonnie." "Yes," Nancy replied. "My son Tony is over there." Joyce pointed towards the back of the room. Nancy brought Bonnie to the boy and made sure that they got along, looked at each other with smiles. At that moment, Joyce's husband Brian entered the living room. One look at him was enough for Nancy to realise that Brian was similar to her husband. Although he didn't resemble Patrick physically, except for being tall, he had the same determined and firm look. However, he also had something hard, cold and strong about him. I wonder if Joyce also doesn't know him, just as I don't know Patrick, Nancy suddenly thought. Or do they have a real family with a warm and trusting relationship? "Is everyone here?" Brian cheerfully asked. "Then let's go to the table." When dinner was nearly finished, Nancy said, "Everything is delicious. You're a great cook." Joyce laughed. "Thank you, but it wasn't me. We hired a chef today." "Oh," was all Nancy could say. "Very convenient." The idea would never have occurred to her. She was used to doing everything herself, even when she was exhausted. Joyce, on the other hand, didn't seem to like difficulties. The men stood up from the table. "We're going to have a smoke and discuss business in the study," said Brian. "You girls have fun?" Joyce gave him a dazzling smile. "Don't worry about us." When the men left, Joyce filled 2 glasses with pink champagne, almost to the brim. "Let's move to the living room," she suggested, handing 1 glass to Nancy. "It'll be easier to monitor the kids from there." The children were happily occupied. Bonnie was expecting a large plush dragon, while Tony was busy stacking multicoloured rings on a pyramid. "They seem to be getting along well," Nancy observed with a smile. "I hope we can too," Joyce responded. "Otherwise, I'm bound to die from boredom here." She raised her glass for a toast. Nancy responded in kind and they drank. "How do you manage living here?" the new neighbour continued. "I'd go insane in such isolation." "I have Bonnie for company." "Well, I adore my son, but sometimes I crave adult conversation, and my husband isn't much of a talker." Nancy grinned. She was growing fond of Joyce. "Mine neither," she sighed. "That's the price to pay for a quiet, nourished and safe life," Joyce said thoughtfully, her cheeks flushed and her beautiful red curls slightly dishevelled. "Living in the middle of nowhere, taking care of the house and the baby, keep yourself in shape, be always flawless in front of your husband's partners, pretend you don't know about his mistresses," she continued. "All this just to avoid working for mere pennies, like my peers, and to be able to afford beautiful clothes and expensive cosmetics." She laughed nervously, and Tony looked at his mother in surprise. "It's all right, sweetheart," Joyce reassured him. "Mummy's just a bit more relaxed today." "Mistresses?" Nancy asked. "Does Brian cheat on you?" Joyce waved her hand dismissively. "They all cheat." "But you're so beautiful." "And so are you. They all choose beautiful partners. They don't settle for less," Joyce said, and took another sip from her nearly empty glass. "I don't understand," Nancy said. "You have a wonderful house, a beautiful son. You're a real model. Why would Brian cheat on you?" Joyce looked at her with surprise, as if Nancy had asked about some elementary things. "How many dolls does your daughter have?" she asked suddenly. "I don't know. 15 or 20, I guess." "Are they all pretty?" Yeah." She had no idea what Joyce was trying to tell her. "Does your daughter always play with one or different ones?" "It depends on her mood, but in general she likes variety. She'd get bored with one thing quickly." "Exactly. Don't you see the truth?" she asked. "To our husbands, we are just dolls. They would tire of playing with just one." "But I'm his wife, not just some girl. We've been together for almost 5 years." Joyce grinned. "And what attracted you to him? What does he know about you, other than your beauty? Does he ask you about your dreams? Does he know your favourite book? Does he surprise you with special gifts?" Nancy bit her lower lip, her mind flashing back to the day when she tried on a beautiful dress for prom, and Patrick looked at her with a scrutinizing gaze. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but he chose me to be his wife for some reason, didn't he?" "Because you're the right fit. It's like buying milk at the store. If it's out of stock, you buy any kind, choosing the best option based on price, quality and flavour that's available." "So you and I are just the right ones at this moment?" "Yes. Brian knows that I'm a good wife, that I'm suitable to show off to his rich friends, that I can organise a dinner party, and that I won't pick at my teeth with my fork in a restaurant. He chose me just like he chose his car or the tie for his new suit." At that moment, male voices were heard nearby. Joyce perked up. "Here come our boys," she said in an entirely different, clear voice. "We've been missing you guys." This conversation with the new neighbour lingered in Nancy's mind. She realised that Joyce's thoughts echoed her own suspicions, which she had often brushed aside due to fear. The only thing she didn't want to confront was Patrick's potential infidelity. Although he didn't show her much passion or tenderness, he had been a good husband over the years. He gave her expensive gifts, flowers, never monitored her expenses, was polite to her parents, and even occasionally asked her about her well-being. The thought that Patrick might have another woman, or even women, disgusted Nancy, so she tried to banish such thoughts from her mind. Meanwhile, communication with Joyce began to improve. She came to visit the next day with Tony. "I'm sorry I'm coming so soon," she said. "It's just terribly boring at home." Nancy smiled. "I'm overjoyed you came. I don't have much to do here either. Bonnie has grown up, and I'm not as busy now as I was the first year after her birth." "Oh," said Joyce. "Will you show me the house?" "Sure." Joyce admired the interior. "Who designed this? It's perfect. Did you see my place? It's a nightmare. It cost a lot of money, and it's just awful." "I did it all myself," Nancy confessed. "You did it yourself?" Joyce was aghast. "So you're a designer by education?" Nancy smiled wistfully. "I have no education. I finished high school and that summer I married Patrick." "That's incredible." Joyce was surprised. "Well, I only managed 2 years in law school, and I can't say that it's been useful." Later, as they sat in the living room drinking tea with homemade cookies, Joyce provided a suggestion. "Maybe you could make my house look this cool?" Nancy was surprised. "You just moved in and renovated it, didn't you? You said it yourself. You had spent so much money." Joyce casually waved her hand. "Money isn't a problem." "Don't worry about it at all. Brian lets me spend as much as I want." She smiled, revealing her perfectly white and even teeth. "We have to have some fun in this life, don't we?" "Okay, I'll think about it," replied Nancy. Joyce gently squeezed her hand. "I'd really appreciate it." Thus, their visits continued. Nancy couldn't imagine her life without her energetic and cheerful neighbour. They were both in similar situations, but their approaches were different. Nancy felt trapped in a golden cage, with Bonnie being her only escape. Joyce, although in a similar position, made her cage as comfortable as possible and indulged in all available luxuries. Almost every day, Joyce arranged for a car with a private driver for city trips. She started to take Nancy and Bonnie along. Joyce could drive herself, but only when she was in a good mood and not intending to drink, which wasn't often. Thus, for the first time in 5 years, Nancy began to experience the joys of a luxurious life. They went shopping, buying extravagantly expensive but beautiful items. They dined in restaurants with children's rooms where Bonnie and Tony would spend time. Joyce also introduced her friend to beauticians and masseurs. "I see Brian's wife has been a good influence on you," Patrick told her one evening. "Why?" Nancy asked in surprise. Her husband shrugged and removed his shirt. "You seem happier, more cheerful. I like it. I'm going to shower." He left, and Nancy, out of habit, picked up his shirt to put it in the laundry basket. An unfamiliar scent hit her nostrils. It was a feminine perfume, but it wasn't hers. She brought the shirt closer to her nose. It definitely smelled like perfume. "No," Nancy thought, "I must be imagining things. I shouldn't have sampled so many perfumes at the mall today. Some of the scent must have lingered in my nostrils." She quickly tossed the shirt into the washing machine and started it. This incident was the first time Nancy sensed something was off. After that, she started noticing more things. The faint smell of wine on her husband when he returned late from meeting friends, even though she knew Patrick only drank whiskey with them. The perfume scent she had once detected was appearing more frequently and couldn't be explained by her visits to the mall. A few times she noticed long dark hairs on his jacket, but most significantly, she sensed a change in Patrick's behaviour towards her. He had never been affectionate, but now he seemed even more distant. They barely spoke, despite not being in conflict. Sometimes Nancy felt as if he had stopped noticing her, like one might overlook a broken TV gathering dust in a corner. One evening, Patrick was late to work again. She had already put her daughter to bed and went to bed herself, but sleep did not come. "We need to talk," thought Nancy, "because I can't go on like this." However, the prospect of such a conversation didn't please her either. None of the options seemed to promise a good evening. "Perhaps Patrick will deny it, saying that I'm imagining things, then everything will remain the same, except that I will continue to doubt him. Or he'll confess, which is even worse. Then I either endure his cheating for the rest of my life or get a divorce. And where will I go with a little daughter? To my parents in the country? I don't think they would be happy about that. And I, without an education, can hardly find any work to support myself and Bonnie. Is pretending that nothing is happening, like my friend does, the only option left?" Nancy tossed and turned, unable to sleep. She got up and decided to work on the sketches for Joyce and Brian's new house interior, but her notebook with the ideas was left downstairs in the living room. Upon going downstairs, Nancy noticed the light on in her husband's study. Judging by the voices coming from over there, he wasn't alone. She quietly approached the door. "Are you sure?" a familiar male voice asked. It was Brian. "Yes," her spouse replied. "It will be a boy." "Wow, congratulations." There was a chinking sound like glasses toasting. Nancy decided not to go in and stopped outside the slightly ajar door. "And what are you going to do with Nancy? Divorce?" Brian asked. "Divorce might be a problem. When I married her, I foolishly forgot to draw up a prenup," her husband admitted. "Oh boy." "Yeah, now she can take half of my property, especially with a small child. You know, the court always sides with the mother in these cases." "Do you think she'll sue? She's a simple rustic woman," Brian asked. "Do not underestimate her. After so many years with her, I still don't know what's going on inside her head." "Just like I didn't understand what's inside of you," thought Nancy. "Then you only have one way out," said Brian thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" His interlocutor didn't understand. "Well, think about it yourself. You have a new favourite woman who carries under her heart a long-awaited heir, and you can't divorce a wife who only gave birth to a daughter." Nancy clamped her mouth with both hands. "Are they really saying what I think they're saying?" she blurted out. "An accident?" asked Patrick. "Yes, that would be perfect. I'll give Bonnie to her grandmother to raise." The clinking of glasses sounded again. Nancy became afraid. What if they come out of the office right now, see me, realise that I heard everything? What will my husband do to me then? Kill me on the spot while our daughter sleeps upstairs? "Listen, why don't we go to my place?" Brian's voice suddenly sounded. "My partner brought me such a whiskey the other day. There are probably only 10 bottles of it left in the world." "Let's go." Luckily, Nancy hid in the shadow of the stairs just in time, and they didn't notice her. Once the men closed the door behind them, she raced upstairs to her daughter's room. What should I do? Where should I go? Should she call her parents? But how can they help? Nancy bitterly thought they probably wouldn't believe their beloved son-in-law could do such a thing. Shall I call the police? But I don't have any evidence, only an overheard conversation. Shall I call Joyce? She's probably asleep by now. But can she help me? What if Brian threatened her too? I need to run. Get out of here as quickly as possible. How much time do I have while Patrick and Brian drink their whiskey and plan? An hour or two? Once they finish their drinks, Patrick will have made his decision, and I won't have time to think. If I'm going to run away, it has to be now. There was no time to think. Nancy quickly changed into a t-shirt, jeans, sneakers and a jacket. The weather was warm, but it was best to dress more securely. She packed the necessary clothes for herself and her daughter into her backpack, along with the jewellery her husband had given her, and some cash. Unfortunately, it wasn't much. She didn't take her cards or her phone, knowing Patrick could track them. The most challenging part was getting Bonnie out of bed and dressed. "Mummy?" the girl asked sleepily. "Don't worry, sunshine," said Nancy, slipping boots onto her feet and buttoning up her jacket. "We're just going for a walk." She cradled Bonnie in her arms. The child seemed to have fallen back to sleep. "Where to now? We can't go through the settlement. The guards will spot us. There's only one way left. The forest. It starts behind our yard and will shorten the journey to the city. We'll probably have to walk all night, but I'm ready for that. It's warm outside and the moon is almost full. Large predatory beasts are unlikely to live in the forest this close to human habitation. At least it's better than staying at home with a man who casually discusses my death over a glass of whiskey. Joyce was right. We are just accessories to our husbands. Things. The suitable things. And when Patrick found someone more suitable, someone who'd bear his son, he decided to get rid of the woman that he no longer needed. Nancy didn't know how long she walked through the forest like this, an hour, 2, or even more. At first, she didn't feel tired and kept walking without really seeing the path. Bonnie woke up 2 or 3 times, looked around in surprise, and almost immediately fell back asleep. Probably thinks she's dreaming, Nancy thought. I wish it was so. Sometimes she felt as though all of this was a dream, or that she had gone mad in the middle of the night, fleeing home and now wandering through the woods with a child in her arms. She hoped that after a while she would see in the distance the light of flashlights, people dressed in reflective vests. They would find her and Bonnie and take them to Patrick. From afar, Nancy would see him crying, and then he would rush to them and hold them tight. He'd take his daughter in his arms, shower her with kisses, then kiss Nancy and confess his love for them, saying he couldn't live without them. Did he ever say that he loved me? Nancy suddenly wondered. Or Bonnie? She had already struggled to shuffle her feet and kept trying to remember whether Patrick, at least once in 5 years of life together, had said that he loves her. Now it seemed that nothing in the world was more important than that. Fatigue hit her abruptly. She had been walking, but upon spotting a thick fallen tree, she realized she couldn't take another step. Nancy sat on it, adjusting her sleeping daughter comfortably on her lap. That's when she noticed her intense thirst. In her haste, she hadn't thought to bring along even a bottle of water or a pack of Bonnie's favourite cookies. The forest was quiet, devoid of the sounds Nancy anticipated. She thought that she was walking along the highway leading into town. She expected to hear the occasional cars passing by, even at this late hour, but it was eerily silent. Suddenly, Nancy heard a solitary night bird's song and leaves rustling in the trees overhead. She was suddenly seized with fear. Why had she run into the forest at night with her child? Even if she was in danger, Patrick wouldn't likely harm her at this moment. He would probably arrive home late, drunk, go to bed, and head to work in the morning. This would give Nancy the entire day to think. She could quietly gather their belongings with Bonnie, take a taxi to the city, or ask Joyce for a ride. She could withdraw all her money, get a new SIM card. The money she had would last for a considerable time. She could move to another city, rent an apartment, and live there with her daughter for a while. Why had she acted so rashly? The answer was clear. She had acted out of fear. Nancy stood up, realizing she was lost. But she had to keep moving. Maybe she was far from the highway, or perhaps there were simply no cars at this hour. Regardless, she couldn't just stand there. How soon would Patrick realize they were gone? Time was her only advantage. The forest was gradually starting to lighten when Nancy spotted the outline of a forest house in the distance. As she approached, she surmised that the house had been vacant for quite some time. In the pre-dawn twilight, the dwelling appeared ancient and gloomy, but none of this mattered to Nancy anymore. All she desired was a bed, a bench, or even just a wooden floor. Any flat surface where she could lie down. She moved her legs mechanically, her eyes glazed over, and Bonnie, in her arms, felt 10 times heavier than usual. The backpack straps cut heavily into her shoulders. Nancy tried to open the door, but it was locked. She mustered all her strength and tried again, to no avail. All right, she decided. I'll just rest here. Without even removing her backpack, she sat down on the porch next to the door, held her daughter closer, and closed her eyes. Nancy didn't quite comprehend what transpired next. Whether it was a dream or reality was unclear. She heard a male voice asking something and trying to wake her up. Then she was practically lifted and carried into the house. She held on to Bonnie tightly, fearing to drop her. Then she felt a sudden lightness as someone removed her backpack. The last thing she could vaguely recall was being laid on something soft with the scent of dry grass. She checked to ensure Bonnie was beside her before finally succumbing to sleep. It's called a mitten. A mitten, you wear it on your hand to keep it warm. Not now, of course, it's summer and you don't need them, but when winter comes, we'll need mittens. The voice was clearly a man's, and an unfamiliar one. Nancy gradually regained consciousness. She realized she was lying with her eyes closed in an unknown room, not at home. The bed beneath her was narrow and hard. The events of the previous night slowly started to resurface in her memory. There she was, restlessly tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep. Lights and voices echoed from behind her husband's study door. The dark forest, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, flickering through the foliage. "Bonnie?" Nancy abruptly sat up on the bed and opened her eyes. "Finally, your mother is awake too," the same male voice said. Her daughter was sitting on the floor, a large, furry, brown, knitted mitten in her hands, which she was examining. Bonnie noticed her mother watching her and smiled happily. Beside her daughter sat a strange man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with light red hair, a dark red beard and green eyes. "Are you awake?" he asked cheerfully. "We've been waiting." Light was streaming through the window. Nancy realized she must have slept for quite some time. "What time is it?" she asked. "Almost 2 p.m. Your daughter has been awake for a while, or is she not a daughter?" He furrowed his brow. "Daughter," Nancy confirmed. She surveyed her surroundings. They appeared to be inside the house they had sought shelter in the previous day. The walls were made of wooden logs, the furniture was simple, and the entire space was a single room. To the left of the front door were nails on which various large, dark jackets hung. It was apparent these belonged to the stranger. Nancy spotted her jacket and her daughter's among them too. To the right was the kitchen, followed by a dining table and chairs, the bed she was currently lying on, and another table with wooden figures scattered on it. "Who are you?" Nancy asked. The stranger sighed. "You are an interesting woman. You arrive at my hut in the middle of the forest with a small child in your arms before sunrise. You faint, sleep for half a day, and when you wake, your first action is to inquire about my identity. And I am just a recluse, living my own life." Nancy sighed. "I'm sorry. I've had a rough night. I'm Nancy and this is my daughter Bonnie." "My name is Tyler," said the man in a friendly voice. "Nice to meet you. Are you a woodsman or something?" "I just live in the forest. No one appointed me to this role and I don't receive a salary." Nancy shifted her legs, suddenly aware of aches and pains throughout her body, her neck, back, and shins. She began to massage her neck gently. "Do you live in the woods all alone?" Tyler smiled and affirmed it with nodding. "That's strange," Nancy said quietly to herself. It says the woman who ran all night through the forest with a child in her arms," he retorted. Nancy turned serious. "Do you know how long I was walking?" "It's not difficult to guess. You are, as you might say, deep in the woods. It's at least a 2-hour walk from here to any road. Your shoes and the way you passed out on the porch tell me that. By the way, would you like to wash up and eat?" Nancy nodded. "Let's show you everything." Nancy hesitated, glancing back at her daughter. "She'll be all right," sighed the housemaster, catching her look. "We've been playing for hours, and I fed her." "Thank you," Nancy replied. She was still confused about where she was and who this man was, but she knew she needed to regain her senses first. There were a few more outbuildings behind the house. "A rustic toilet," Tyler pointed out. "I hope you know how to use one of these." "I do. I grew up in the country," she responded. He glanced at her. "Wow, you can't tell," he replied, then continued. "That's a summer shower. The water's slightly warm, but you can wash up. For hot water, you'll need to heat the sauna." He looked around. "I think that's it." "Thank you," Nancy replied. When she finished and returned to the house, she saw Bonnie on the bed, playing with wooden figures. Nancy, worried her daughter might get a splinter, came closer and picked up one of the toys. Her fears were unfounded. The figures were well polished and had a pleasant scent of fresh wood. "Gorgeous," said Nancy, examining the wooden bird with skillfully carved feathers. "How long have you been doing this?" 3 years. shrugged Tyler. "Sit down at the table. You need to eat well." Once Nancy ensured her daughter was securely seated and unlikely to fall, she joined Tyler at the table. He served her a large bowl of soup that emitted an appetizing aroma. It appeared to be a mushroom soup with chicken and noodles. "I can't eat that much," she protested. Tyler grinned. "It only seems so. You just start." He placed a wicker bread box on the table, filled with flatbread. "Is that homemade too?" Nancy asked. "Everything here is homemade," the house owner replied somewhat indignantly. He was right. Nancy finished the soup and the flatbread. "More?" he asked. She shook her head, leaning back in her chair. It was just food, but she felt calm for the first time since last night, as if a knot inside her had finally been untied. "Thank you, Tyler," she said, looking the man in the eye. "I don't know what led me to your house, but I do know that without you, we wouldn't have survived." "Oh, come on. Who wouldn't help in a situation like this? You should tell me from whom you were running from. What kind of monster made you think it was a good idea to dash through the woods at night with a baby in your arms?" Nancy brushed away a tear that had suddenly appeared with her sleeve. "My husband." Usually, Nancy was not known for being overly trusting, but now she herself didn't know what was wrong. Whether it was the stress taking a toll, she was just too tired to keep everything bottled up, or the man with kind green eyes sitting across from her inspired such immense trust. She had told him everything, her life story, especially in detail, from the moment of the first meeting with Patrick to the moment she fainted on the porch of his forest house. Tyler listened attentively, frowned, sighed, and only occasionally asked clarifying questions. When Nancy finished, he asked, "And what was your plan?" "Survive, and then we'll see." "Well, you survived the first night relatively well. What's next?" "I don't know. I suppose we should get to town. Then we can go to my parents' house." "Do you think your husband will be looking for you and your daughter?" "Of course." "Where's the first place he's going to go?" "To my parents," Nancy said and rubbed the bridge of her nose tiredly. "I don't know. We'll just need to get lost in the city. Hopefully, considering his money and connections." Nancy realized that Patrick could quickly find them if he wanted to. "I see. You can stay here if you like," said Tyler suddenly. "Here?" "Yes. I doubt it would occur to him that you were in the woods with a stranger." "Yeah," the woman said and looked intently at Tyler. "Why don't you tell me about yourself?" "Well, I'm just a very normal man. Normal men of your age don't live in the woods." "How old do you think I am?" 30? 31. "I think," Nancy said, "you've lived through just as many strange events as I have." He grinned. "Let's discuss it later. You need to rest." For the first 3 days, Nancy and her daughter mostly slept and ate. Nancy was anxious, constantly expecting her husband to walk through the door. Gradually, she began to calm down. It seemed one could get used to anything, even her life, transitioning from living in a huge house to a cabin in the woods. Nancy was also surprised by her daughter's calm acceptance. Perhaps Bonnie was too young to comprehend the situation fully, or maybe she was not surprised by her father's absence, as she saw him rarely. Despite not living in the village for many years, Nancy found it easy to adapt to this lifestyle. She was continually amazed at how Tyler managed to live comfortably in the simple forest house, seemingly needing little. She was particularly curious about the source of drinking water. The sauna and shower needed a lot of water too. "There's a nearby river," the master of the house explained. "I have a water pipe running from there." "We are drinking river water?" Nancy asked in horror. "Don't take me for a lunatic," Tyler took offense. "See that shed? There is an automatic filtration station inside. It's all safe." Tyler also maintained a vegetable garden, growing almost all the vegetables and berries that the climate allowed. He bought meat in the city and stored it in the basement. Out of curiosity, Nancy ventured down there and found it to be as cold as a large freezer, even in summer. "There's also additional room," Tyler said, "where I store all sorts of pickles and jams." "Wow! What do you buy besides meat?" Nancy asked. "Cereal, pasta, flour, occasionally canned goods, vitamins, and so on," he replied. "And how do you get to the city?" Tyler gestured vaguely to the side. "There's a barely visible path that starts just a bit further down. If you don't know it's there, you won't see it. Follow it for 2 hours and you'll reach the village. I have an arrangement with one of the locals who keeps my car in his garage. I use it to get to the city." "So you have to carry what you buy for 2 hours?" "Why not? I'm healthy, and exercise is good for me. I also get meat, milk, eggs, sour cream, and cottage cheese from the locals." "How often do you go out?" "I limit my trips to once every 2 or 3 months. In the winter I stay here all the time. There's no pleasure in walking for 2 hours in the cold, especially with a load. In the summer I visit the village more often, maybe even once a week." "How do you keep yourself entertained, especially in the winter?" Tyler smiled. "Well, you saw. I make figurines out of wood. You're about to be very surprised, but we have internet here." "Internet?" "Yes. No civilization can hide from it. Look at what I'm about to show you." He pulled out a laptop, a cell phone, and a tablet from the closet. Although Nancy wasn't particularly tech-savvy, she recognized the devices from what her husband used and had a rough idea of how much they cost. The devices Tyler was showing her were clearly not cheap. The image of the mysterious forest hermit was getting more intriguing. "He clearly has, or at least had, a lot of money," thought Nancy. "Who is he hiding from? From criminal friends?" She resolved to find out. Despite the kindness Tyler had shown her and Bonnie, she would feel more at ease knowing more about him. Gradually, Nancy found herself taking on a share of the daily chores. She cooked, washed dishes, cleaned the house, watered the vegetable garden and did laundry. After a while she realized they were living like a real family. "You work very hard," Tyler, who had just returned from another trip to the village, told Nancy with a frown. Nancy was outside hanging laundry, while Bonnie played with wooden figurines nearby. Bonnie had grown fond of them, and Tyler carved her a new one every few days. "Actually, we're living at your place," Nancy responded. "We have housing, food, entertainment, thanks to you." "Entertainment?" Tyler snorted. "Your tablet has an excellent library. I've never read so much and with such pleasure," Nancy admitted. "I'm glad you found an interesting occupation in this wilderness," Tyler said, "and don't worry about money and other things. Even if 100 more mothers with children came to me, I could provide and feed them all." "Really?" Nancy asked. "I knew you were rich." Tyler frowned, as if he had said something unnecessary. "You're not poor either." "My husband is not poor," Nancy corrected him, sighing. Tyler looked at her strangely. "Let's sit on the porch tonight after Bonnie falls asleep. You'll see how beautiful the evening is in the forest." Nancy thought for a moment. "I saw some homemade liqueur in your cellar." "I can't hide anything from you." Nancy wasn't a fan of drinking, but she decided that the liqueur would be her ally today, helping her get Tyler to open up. In the evening, once Bonnie was asleep, they quietly slipped outside and sat on the porch, staring silently into the distance. Initially, Nancy couldn't make sense of anything. Then she began to notice the fading colours of the day, the shifting shadows, and the gradual silencing of the daytime sounds of birds and insects. She became aware of the night sounds growing more audible. "It's beautiful," Nancy remarked quietly. "Yes," Tyler replied in an equally soft tone. "I've seen it countless times, but I never tire of it." Nancy smiled, stealing a glance at him. At first he had seemed strange to her, an unkempt, towering, burly forester with a thick red beard and a grim sense of humour. But the more they interacted, the more she realized how deep and sensitive Tyler was. He seemed well educated and clearly knew more than he let on. Nancy took out the glasses she had brought from the kitchen and poured a little bit of pear liqueur into each. A fruity aroma filled the air. "To our strange acquaintance," said Nancy, holding out a glass to Tyler. He smiled, took the glass and clinked it lightly with Nancy's. "To our strange acquaintance." The drink was moderately sweet, but potent. Nancy took a small sip and tried not to grimace. "Very tasty," she said. Tyler nodded. "So let me clarify. Your plan was to get me drunk and uncover my terrible past, wasn't it?" "Yes," Nancy admitted with a shy smile. "Fine, I'll tell you." "I'd appreciate it." Tyler sighed and ruffled his hair. How does he cut his hair? Nancy suddenly wondered. Does he go to the city or do it himself? "You guessed right," Tyler began. "I come from a wealthy family." Nancy smiled. "A very wealthy family," he added, grimacing, as if the fact were unpleasant. "And I'm not from around here. I was born on the other side of the country." "Wow." "Yes, and my family was one of the most influential in that city." "Is that related to crime?" "You guess well." "Well, that would explain a lot." The man sighed. "Long story short, yes. My father is a serious criminal mastermind, and a few other close relatives are too. Uncles, cousins, you name it." "Have you always known about this?" Nancy asked. "Not exactly," he replied. "When I was young, my mum would tell me, and my brother, that my dad was just away on business." "Wait, you have a brother? Older or younger?" "I had a brother. He was older than me, but only by an hour. We are twins." Nancy frowned but didn't say anything. He continued. "As teenagers, we began to understand our family's business, what our father, uncles, and older cousins were involved in. I was horrified, but my brother enjoyed it. In a way, I was fortunate. Since he was technically older, my father saw my brother as his successor. I wasn't initially attracted to the family business. When we came of age, my father began to teach us his business. As time went on, my brother became more involved in all of this. I increasingly felt the need to remove him from the situation and escape together. Despite my attempts to persuade him, he wouldn't listen. He spoke of the inevitability of evil, and that we had to keep control, and that if we didn't, others would come along who would be worse. Then he was gone," he concluded. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "It wasn't unexpected. Something like this was bound to occur at some point. When he passed away, my father and I went to see him. I looked at his face, and it reminded me of his youthful expression from our childhood. It was like staring at the young boy I'd known my whole life, who was always there for me, but now he was gone forever." "How did you get over it?" "I don't know if I did. It was also hard for my parents. My father appeared devastated. He then told me I had to fill my elder brother's shoes." "Oh my goodness." "That's when I left. You see me now in a more or less sane state, but then I just wanted to hide from the world." "Did it work?" "Yes, until you started knocking on my door early one summer morning." Nancy laughed. "Well, I'm sorry." "I'm overjoyed things turned out the way they did. I haven't felt so calm and alive in years." "Me too," said Nancy suddenly, and then changed the topic. "I need to go to town. I want to contact my parents and assure them I'm okay. They must be worried." "Okay, we'll go." "Could someone from your village drive me to town? I'd like you to stay with Bonnie." "Are you sure?" "Yes, don't worry, I'll be careful." "Okay. I'll speak to the man who keeps the car." After several weeks in the woods, the sight of so many people was odd to Nancy. The noise started to give her a headache. With a heavy heart, she dialed her parents' number. Hello? Her father's voice came through the receiver. Dad, it's me, Nancy answered. There was a pause on the line. Nancy? Her father said hesitantly. Oh my God, where are you? What's wrong with you? Patrick came to see us. He said you and Bonnie disappeared. We're fine, Daddy. Where are you? Nancy hesitated, unsure whether to reveal everything. We're with good people. Dad, don't worry, we're fine. Did you have a good reason for doing this? Yes. Can I tell your mum you called? She's at the store right now, but she'll be back soon. Tell her, Daddy, so she wouldn't worry. Okay. Will we see you? Sure, but I don't know when yet. Oh, my daughter, I was so worried about you. For the first time, her father was talking to his daughter alone, without his wife. I never liked your Patrick, but I never said anything against him because your mother was just happy. And when he came the last time, he looked so excited and nervous. I became frightened for you. Nancy listened to her father, goosebumps running down her back. It's all right now, Daddy, she said. Don't worry, I'll sort everything out. Okay, daughter, if you need anything, you can always come to me. Thanks, Dad. I have to go now, but I'll call you again soon. Give my granddaughter a kiss for me. Okay. After her conversation with her father, Nancy felt both calmer and more anxious. She was comforted by her father's kind voice and the knowledge of his support. Then she dialed another number. Hi, Nancy said, not really expecting to be recognized. Nancy? Joyce sounded shocked. You're alive! Thank God! Her relief was really genuine. Yes, I'm alive, Nancy confirmed. I've already imagined the worst, sighed Joyce. What happened? Can we meet? Do you need help? Money? Nancy smiled, appreciating Joyce's concern, and they arranged to meet in a week. Nancy herself didn't know how the meeting with Joyce would help. She just realized she wanted to see her friend. Although she and Bonnie were safe with Tyler for now, she knew it couldn't last forever. She thought about this a lot. The only option seemed to be to run away, so far that her husband wouldn't find her and her daughter. But was that even possible? Nevertheless, she needed money for that. All her reflections led to the conclusion that it was best to stay here with Tyler as long as possible. Nancy didn't want to admit it, but she desired to stay for other reasons as well. She began to realize the vast differences between Patrick and Tyler, and most importantly, how different her feelings were for these two men. Patrick had always been a stranger to her. Looking at him, she wondered what he was thinking, what emotions he held. Tyler was entirely different. His warmth was palpable. She could feel it with every fibre of her being. Bonnie understood this as well. She trusted him easily from day one. Nancy also trusted him unconditionally and did not want to leave him. Are you going to the city again? Tyler asked with concern when Nancy told him her plans. I want to talk to my friend. She might give some advice. Would you mind looking after Bonnie again? He frowned. Of course not. We had a great time last time. Bonnie turned her gaze to Tyler and smiled to him, showing her small white teeth. The man smiled back and playfully tickled her. Bonnie laughed so freely that Nancy felt a wave of warmth. I'm worried about you, Tyler said. You've been lucky once, but what if your father or friend have already told everything to Patrick? It could be a trap. They wouldn't do that. Okay, just be careful. They met Joyce at a small, inconspicuous cafe on the outskirts of town. Her friend's expensive clothes made her stand out significantly. Thankfully, there were hardly any customers at this time of day. Darling, Joyce exclaimed, pulling her friend tightly against her. I'm so happy to see you, Nancy replied. As they sat down at the table, Nancy noticed that Joyce was trying to discreetly wipe away her tears. Why are you so moved? Nancy asked in surprise. I thought you had died, Joyce admitted. Why did you think so? Her friend looked up at Nancy. We had a conversation with Brian the night you and Bonnie disappeared. Nancy froze. Tell me, she said. Joyce started to crumple a paper napkin, her hands shaking. Late one night, when my son and I were asleep, Brian and your husband came in. They sat downstairs quietly at first, then their laughter grew louder as they discussed something. I couldn't hear their conversation. I wish I had. It lasted until morning. I hadn't slept much and I had a headache. I lost my temper and confronted my husband. I told him we had a small child and I wouldn't tolerate such behaviour in our home. Joyce paused, looking up at her friend with her large blue eyes. Then Brian grabbed my throat and pinned me against the wall, she continued, and told me I was lucky. He said, your best friend is about to leave for the other world, and I'm tolerating you for now. Nancy shivered, feeling a tremor run through her. Joyce exhaled sharply. You can't imagine how scared I was then, she said. I hoped it was a drunken joke. I wanted to call you, but I couldn't. Brian was next to me. And then Patrick called him and told him that you were missing. I didn't know what to think. Of course, I wanted to hope that you somehow found out about everything and you ran away. But I also couldn't stop thinking that Patrick had done something to you. Joyce began to cry. It's all right, Nancy said firmly. I managed to find out about my husband's plans. We ran away. A good man took us in. We're safe. I don't know what to do next, though. Joyce calmed down, raised her head to say something, and suddenly gasped. Oh no, he's been following me. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Nancy looked back. Brian and Patrick were approaching them. She began to think quickly, even surprising herself. Run, Nancy shouted, grabbing her friend's hand. Through the second door. Quickly, Joyce snapped out of her daze and ran with Nancy towards the exit opposite the one their husbands had just entered. They sprinted inside and jumped into Joyce's car. We have to get them off our backs, the woman exclaimed. Nancy spotted Brian and Patrick sprinting towards their own car. Where are we going? She asked in terror. We'll leave the city via the highway, Joyce answered confidently. Then we'll lose them and figure out our next steps. We just need to buy some time. They drove surprisingly fast, but Nancy noticed they were being followed by a car driven by Brian. Brian seldom drives himself, Joyce noted, and I've taken extreme driving courses before. We can outrun them. Nancy desperately wanted to believe this. She was terrified of what Patrick might do if they were caught. Would he kill her on the spot? Kidnap her and lock her in a basement? Would he find out where Bonnie was and hurt Tyler too? She gripped the seatbelt so tightly it would leave marks on her hands. Joyce was recklessly driving on the highway, overtaking, cutting off, and even using the oncoming lane. Despite the initial caution, Brian began to follow suit when he realized they were falling behind. In the first moment, Nancy could barely comprehend what was happening. She saw a massive truck slowing down in the rearview mirror, and something seemed to change in the line of vehicles. Oh my God! Joyce exclaimed in horror, pulling over and stopping. 2 weeks after the funeral, as Nancy was packing her belongings, there was a knock at the door. Come in, she called out. As expected, it was Joyce and Tony. Nancy and her friend hadn't seen much of each other in the past 2 weeks. There was too much to handle. Almost packed already? Yes, replied Nancy. I mostly took personal items and things that Bonnie liked. Are you sure you're going to give up the inheritance? Patrick had parents and a brother. They can inherit everything. But Bonnie is still his daughter, Joyce said. Nancy grinned. He never considered her his heiress. We don't need his money. Joyce smiled. But I won't give up mine. Tony and I need it. Nancy came closer and took her hand. Of course, you shouldn't refuse Brian's inheritance, especially after what you've told me about Brian all these years. Joyce looked away. I want to forget it as soon as possible, Nancy hugged her. They stood like that for a few seconds, then broke the embrace. "Are you going to live in this house?" Nancy asked. Joyce wrinkled her nose and shook her head. "I grew to hate it during the short time I lived here. I'm now looking for a suitable apartment in the city. Once my son and I move in, I'll put this house on the market. Although, with the expensive, gaudy finish, it's unlikely to sell quickly." Nancy laughed. "Promise me you'll become an interior designer," Joyce said. "You have a talent for it, and someday you'll furnish my new house." "You'll have to wait a long time." "I'm in no hurry." "Okay," Nancy promised with a laugh. "I should have gone to school a long time ago. Tyler won't be able to take care of Bonnie and me for the rest of his life." "Actually, he can," Joyce reasonably noted. "And it seems like he even wants to. But you're right, learning independence is important. I'm thinking of returning to my university too." At that moment a car honked in the street. "Your Mr. Wright has arrived," Joyce remarked. Nancy blushed. "He's not mine," she replied, but Joyce only smiled in response. "It's strange to think that we won't be living in the forest," Nancy said thoughtfully, sitting in a car. She glanced at her daughter, peacefully sleeping in the back seat. "I think we'll be more comfortable in a normal house," Tyler said with a smile. "Are you ready?" Nancy asked cautiously. The man momentarily glanced away from the road, met her eyes, and nodded. "I am. I now think that maybe I stayed in that forest so long because I was waiting for you to come to me." Nancy smiled. "I'm happy that you've waited." "Me too."
Jake leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He had stayed late at the office, poring over the financial reports of his restaurant chain. The numbers were promising. Naturally, there were issues that required his attention, but that was just part of doing business. Overall, his restaurants were thriving, which was indeed encouraging. Years ago, Jake could only dream of a hearty meal as he struggled with hunger. Now he was wealthy, with a successful business and substantial bank accounts. He could afford to travel the world, drive luxury cars, and wear designer clothes. Yet the trappings of a luxurious life didn't appeal to him. Jake found fulfillment in giving back. He took pleasure in using his wealth to make others a bit happier. He regularly donated to funds for medical treatments and sponsored several orphanages. Most of these institutions were in the capital, where he had lived for over 20 years. Nonetheless, he didn't overlook the orphanage in his hometown. Often he reminisced about his early years. They reminded Jake of his journey from hardship to strength. In addition, his story constantly reminded him that many children in the world have similar struggles and need support. His own children, Billy and Annie, are now old enough to discuss serious matters. Jake has already shared his life story with them, including the hardships he faced at their age. Despite their privileged upbringing, Billy and Annie were sympathetic towards less fortunate children, and that brought their father great pride. Jake was wary of spoiling his heirs excessively. He didn't want his son and daughter to become indifferent and self-centered. He had already seen enough of such offspring of wealthy families, their permissiveness, indifference to others' misfortunes, and belief that the world revolved solely around them. Jake strived to raise Billy and Annie to be compassionate, empathetic, and attentive. His wife, Alberta, supported him in everything. They both grew up in an orphanage. In general, Jake went to an orphanage when he was 9 years old. Before that, he grew up in a loving family. They lived frugally, but they were never impoverished. They had a clean, cozy 2-bedroom apartment and an old car, which Jake's father used to take the family on trips to the river or the mountains. Jake's mother worked as a painter, while his father laboured in a factory. As a child, Jake never pondered about their financial situation. He revelled in his peaceful, sunlit childhood, cherishing his relationships with his parents and friends. Jake's parents never argued, at least not to his recollection. They never raised their voices at him even when he made mistakes. They always spoke to Jake as if he were an adult, explaining the consequences of his actions and the potential outcomes of recklessness. In response, Jake strived not to disappoint them, took responsibility for his actions, excelled in his studies, and refrained from causing trouble. "Remember, there are only 3 of us in this world," his father often reminded, "and we must look after and protect each other." Jake cherished these conversations. To him, their family resembled a close-knit team, Mum, Dad, and him. They were each other's fortress. Jake knew his parents had both grown up in an orphanage. Occasionally they would share stories about those years. Jake would listen captivated. Their childhoods were starkly different from his own. They'd had indifferent educators, hostile peers, and lived in constant hunger. No one cared for them. Jake felt fortunate to have loving and understanding parents. The thought of ending up in an orphanage himself was unimaginable. He had parents who loved him dearly. The only thing missing was grandparents. He saw his friends enjoying their company, savouring Grandma's homemade cakes, and embarking on fishing trips with Grandpa. But such is life. His parents were the best, regardless. Jake would always remember that warm summer day. He was riding his bike to his house. The cool shade would give way to bright sunlight and warmth. The smell of heated herbs filled his nostrils. His loyal friend Ralph was beside him, sharing jokes and stories. But as Jake noticed the crowd of neighbours at his entrance, his heart filled with dread. Jake instinctively knew that his parents were in trouble. This morning they had left to the local market for the fresh and healthy produce, as his mum put it. Jake often accompanied them, enjoying the mini vacations. He relished the peacefulness of the car rides, the scenic view of their fields and hills, and his parents' soft chatter. The village, with farm, market itself, held a unique charm, including a distinct smell that his mother disliked, but Jake somehow enjoyed. It was home to various animals, horses, cows, and goats, which fascinated Jake, though they were commonplace for the local children. But that day, Jake had chosen to stay home. His friend Ralph had invited him to ride bikes in the new park, which had special paths and a newly opened fountain. Jake's parents, always considerate of his wishes, had agreed. "Fine, stay home if you like," his mum had said, ruffling his hair with a smile. "We'll bring you something tasty," Dad promised, settling into the driver's seat. Jake nodded happily. He and Ralph stood at the entrance, waving the adults off, unaware that this would be their last goodbye. It was a marvellous day. Jake and Ralph explored new paths, met other kids, played in the fountain, climbed trees, played with a stray dog, and chased pigeons. Summer vacation was indeed the best time. However, that afternoon divided Jake's life into before and after. Looking for his parents in the crowd near his house, the boy suddenly noticed the anxious and worried faces of his neighbours. And then one of the neighbours finally saw Jake and Ralph. He alerted the others, and soon about a dozen pairs of eyes were fixed on the boys. Jake immediately felt a shiver run through him. Mrs. Weston, the best friend of his mother's and a frequent visitor to their home, was the first to embrace Jake. "There's been a tragedy," she said, looking into his eyes. "You must be strong." The neighbours informed Jake that his father had lost control of the car, which then careened into a ditch at high speed. A hole in the road, previously unnoticed and hence unattended by road services, had caused the accident. The dangerous area was now cordoned off to prevent further accidents, but it was too late for Jake's parents. They had both died in the crash. The news was difficult to comprehend, let alone accept. His parents were his rock, his constants. Jake fainted from the shock. When he came to, he was at Mrs. Weston's house. She had called an ambulance and the doctors gave him an injection. Everyone looked at Jake with sympathy, patting his head and hugging him, but their compassion only made him feel more frightened. Jake didn't think about his future. He was in a strange state, disconnected from his surroundings. Everything around him seemed to slow down, and he felt like an observer in his own life. The neighbours arranged the funeral while Jake stayed with Mrs. Weston, reluctant to return to his now empty home. The woman sent her children to her in-laws temporarily and stayed close to Jake, crying when she thought he couldn't see or hear her. She tried to be calm around him, but it seemed forced. Jake did not attend his parents' funeral. The night before, he had a frightful tantrum, screaming, sobbing, convulsing. This terrified both Mrs. Weston and himself. Jake was taken to the hospital, given medication, and tranquilized. Afterwards, everything seemed unimportant. The boy lay in his hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling. Days later, Jake began to feel better, and Mrs. Weston was allowed to see him. "Jake, you'll have to live in an orphanage for a while," she said in a trembling voice. "But I promise I'll visit you." Jake shuddered. Until now, he hadn't considered where or with whom he would live. His mind was overwhelmed. The mention of an orphanage alarmed and frightened him. How could this be happening? His parents, who were raised in an orphanage, had often told him how fortunate he was to be born into a family, and now he was destined for a similar institution. Tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to hold them back, but to no avail. Mrs. Weston tried to console him, promising to visit him often, and even take him home for the weekend if the orphanage management permitted. But at that moment, Jake understood that he was now alone. His wonderful support system was gone. He would have to navigate his new path on his own. Although at the time, he had no clue about the challenges he would face. In retrospect, it's worth noting that Mrs. Weston and other neighbours did visit him. Mrs. Weston visited most frequently, always bringing gifts. She used to embrace Jake, asked about his life, but over time, these visits became less frequent and eventually stopped. The boy wasn't offended. He understood the situation entirely. He had to mature quickly, realizing that people were busy with their own worries, not the concerns of a neighbour or a young boy. The orphanage was situated outside the city, so the children didn't attend a regular school. Instead, the teachers came to them. On his first day, Jake was attacked by the local boys to assert their dominance. Some girls watched and giggled maliciously. When the tutor arrived, drawn by the noise, the girls claimed that Jake had fallen down the stairs, and the boy was reprimanded by the tutor for his supposed clumsiness. "You know, you did good, not complaining or tattling," one of the bullies later said. "If you had said something about us, we would have beaten you up even more." Jake didn't respond. He hadn't kept silent from fear of further punishment, nor out of a desire to protect his tormentors. It was simply that he knew the tutor wouldn't care or offer any help. Life in the orphanage was difficult and dreary. Adjusting to it was tough. A small private bedroom was replaced with a dormitory housing 10 beds. Instead of his mother's delicious home-cooked meals, he had to eat unappetizing porridge. He was met with indifference and often hostility, rather than acceptance and heartfelt conversations. There were no friends or kind, smiling neighbours here. Jake was immediately disliked. For 9 years he had been a favourite child, and now he found himself among children who had never known such comfort and love. Many of them had endured difficult lives, and held a belief that those more fortunate owed them endlessly. Therefore, physical abuse became part of Jake's life, making each day unpredictable. He tried to stay unnoticed by his tormentors, but it was impossible when they all shared the same sleeping quarters. Treated with cruelty, he was doused with water, tripped up, insulted, spat on, and had objects thrown at him. Yet he had no choice but to endure it all with patience. Jake attempted to befriend the other children, not out of fondness, but to make his life more bearable. However, he found it difficult as these boys from the orphanage, hardened and only understanding the language of force, were vastly different from his friend Ralph. As his schooling began, Jake was surprised and frustrated to discover that the lessons were superficial, with his classmates' academic level exceedingly low. Jake, who had always been a good student, found himself standing out right on the first day. His classmates struggled with basic tasks and had difficulty reading. Finally, a smart student, such a pleasure to work with. The teacher praised him. Jake smiled, pleased to be noticed and spoken of positively. However, that very evening, he was confronted by a group of boys in the backyard. The girls, as always, kept their distance and silently approved. "Think you're the smartest, huh? Don't show off," the boys said with threatening in their voice. Jake was hurt, offended and scared, but he learned his lesson well. He stopped showcasing his knowledge in class and started making deliberate mistakes on tests to avoid standing out. Alberta was in the same class as Jake. She belonged to no particular group of girls and was friends only with those as quiet as her. They often found themselves the targets of their peers' cruel jokes. And Jake quickly realized girls could be even more cruel than boys. They invented such insults for Alberta and her friends that he would cringe. They also ruined their belongings, forced them to take on their duties, and took away the treats given to the children in the canteen. Occasionally, fights erupted among the girls in the yard, featuring biting and hair-pulling. The educators would separate the children and indiscriminately punish them all. Some children, however, were left untouched. As Jake later realized, certain teenagers were simply too intimidating for the adults, and it was easier to punish the quiet ones like Alberta, even going so far as to lock her in a dark storeroom for 24 hours. Jake also spent time in that storeroom, often for no discernible reason. He found it strangely comforting, though. It was quiet and dark, a place where no one bothered him. A couple of years passed, and Jake and Alberta became close friends, even developing romantic feelings for each other. Jake changed during this time. He grew stronger and more resilient, learning to stand up for himself. Much of this change was due to Alberta. It was painful to watch as the other girls bullied her relentlessly, and Jake couldn't take it anymore. One day, he saw how the girls were harassing meek Alberta again, and he stood up for her. He was fully aware of his actions. The girls were initially surprised, then they started to laugh, not just chuckle, but outright laugh. The strongest amongst them pushed Jake back against the wall. The impact was strong, but Jake held his ground and pushed her back. He knew it wasn't appropriate to hit girls, a principle he learned in kindergarten, but in front of him wasn't a girl. It was a monster, a vile, malevolent, merciless one. Then all the girls, who usually resolved conflicts through verbal and physical fights, attacked Jake. Despite being alone, he fought back effectively. The truth was that Jake had been training secretly for quite some time. He used a flour sack in the storeroom as a makeshift punching bag. He did push-ups and pull-ups. He decided to adapt to the rules of the game. If survival in this world meant being the strongest, then he had to be the strongest. "Fool, you're in trouble now," warned one of the girls, the recognized leader of the group. And Jake knew exactly what their threats implied. They would tell their friends everything, and retaliation for his audacity was imminent. Trouble was certainly on the horizon. But Alberta, she looked at him like a hero, a savior. Under her gaze, all looming problems seemed to fade, losing their importance. "Thank you," she whispered. "But what will you do now? They will come after you." "It's all right," Jake assured her. "I'm not afraid of them." At that moment, he truly wasn't afraid of any reprisals. It didn't matter to him. All that mattered was the special way Alberta was looking at him, and her smile. Of course, payback caught up with Jake, and very soon. "What? You've become the coolest?" asked one of his attackers. But the question was rhetorical. Jake was severely beaten. while the girls around suggested various ways to humiliate him. This time, however, Jake fought back a little. He managed to land a few solid hits before he ended up on the ground. His retaliation surprised the attackers, who were used to a passive victim. After this, they occasionally attacked him in groups, but never alone. Breaking away from the memories, Jake sighed, stretched, and turned off his computer, thinking, "It's time to go home. Tomorrow I can sleep longer. Spend time with your family." The man donned a coat and left his office. His car was parked behind the restaurant, near the trash cans. Suddenly, he spotted a poor elderly woman next to him. Dressed in shabby clothes and old sneakers, she was a picture of poverty. Instead of shooing away the homeless, Jake instructed his staff to leave untouched food in containers on the special table near to the bins. He always felt a deep compassion for the destitute individuals. Upon detecting Jake's presence, the poor woman turned to face him, her eyes reflecting anxiety as she studied his approaching figure. As for Jake, he was dumbfounded. This old woman, no, this is simply impossible. But she was very similar to the woman who had once played a key role in his life. The man scrutinized her face, and she was also looking at him, studying. Years ago, while residing in an orphanage, a remarkable event had occurred in Jake's life. A new teacher, Mrs. Fuller, joined their institution. On her first day, the class tested her mettle with cruel jokes, attempts to disrupt the lesson, and even outright insults. Most teachers would either succumb or lose their temper, but Mrs. Fuller responded with an unexpected sadness and pity. Jake, who as always was ashamed of his classmates, watched Mrs. Fuller with interest. She was an extraordinary figure, a fact he promptly recognized. The new teacher conducted a very engaging lesson with animated video. Initially, the students chuckled and attempted to jest, but even the most indifferent and disruptive ones eventually engaged. At the end of the lesson, Mrs. Fuller started asking questions. To Jake's surprise, he knew all the answers. As he responded, the teacher nodded in approval and smiled, seemingly impressed by his competence. She hadn't anticipated finding such a capable student here. No longer fearing jabs from his peers, Jake answered freely. Mrs. Fuller asked him to stay behind after class. "You're an incredibly talented boy," she complimented Jake when they were alone. The boy realized that the teacher had intentionally refrained from praising him in front of his classmates to avoid stirring up envy. He was struck by her wisdom and sensitivity. "Thank you," he responded. "You clearly need to study in a different program. Your level is much higher, and it could be even higher," said the teacher. "I've seen many kids, and I can recognize ability instantly. You're very capable." "Thank you," Jake replied again, both embarrassed and delighted. It had been a long time since anyone had paid him much attention. "Tomorrow, I'll bring you another textbook. You should pursue more serious topics." True to her word, the next day Mrs. Fuller brought a bright, colourful textbook. "We'll review the material with the other students for now. You don't need it. Read this, then tell me what you understand and what you don't." Jake immersed himself in the reading and didn't notice how quickly the lesson passed. "Well, did you understand something?" Mrs. Fuller asked with a smile, leaning over the desk. "I understand everything. Just didn't have time to finish reading. It's a shame, it's interesting." "Take the book with you. You'll have time to finish it. I bought it for my daughter, but she doesn't seem interested. It will be useful to someone at least." Mrs. Fuller enriched Jake's life, making it happier and more meaningful. The other children also liked her very much. She was a unique teacher who connected with her class not through humiliation and strength, but through clear explanations and heartfelt conversations. Both boys and girls were drawn to her. However, it was clear that Mrs. Fuller had a soft spot for Jake. Yet no one objected anymore. His classmates noticed Jake's remarkable progress in the subject, and that he always helped them and never refused anyone, even those who had recently bullied him in the backyard. Jake eagerly read one book after another that Mrs. Fuller provided. Later, the teacher gave the boy a player with several discs. Reading is one thing, listening is another. Listening to serious podcasts can be a bit challenging, but you'll manage, I know. Thanks, but only... Jake eyed the player with doubt. Such a thing is expensive. It's not guaranteed that the boys won't take it away. I'm afraid I can't accept it. Mrs. Fuller seemed to understand everything. I'll arrange it with the principal. He'll allow you into the classroom at certain hours, after school, when no one is here. That way you can study. Does that work for you? Of course, Jake replied cheerfully. It was delightful to do his favourite subject in the serenity of an empty classroom. It was not only about learning, but it also provided a great opportunity to be alone with oneself. Privacy. That's what Jake sorely missed at the orphanage. And here it was perfect. Now, Jake often conversed with Mrs. Fuller, not only about lessons, but they also became almost like real friends. Jake shared with his teacher the story of his tragedy. It felt good to share moments from the past with a sympathetic person. The woman shook her head, occasionally sighing. Oh, it's been hard for you, Jake. Conversations between the teacher and the capable student weren't always serious. Sometimes they laughed and joked, discussed the news, debated, or delightfully found common ground. It was all quite engaging. One day, Mrs. Fuller suggested that Jake participate in a regional competition. The task was to write an essay on the topical issue. Your imagination is excellent and your language skills are top-notch. You can do it, she said. I don't know. Jake expressed his doubts. After all, he was just an orphan boy. Other kids had homes and received tutoring. How could he compete with them? I know. You'll succeed, Mrs. Fuller confidently reassured him. She was persistent, and Jake started working on his essay, finding the task captivating. Alberta assisted with the design of the project, and to everybody's surprise, the essay won the prize and advanced to the next level of the contest. Unlike previous stages, this one required participants to be in the capital. The format was as follows. Each participant goes on stage and receives a task from the jury to compose a speech on a certain topic. Quick thinking, improvisation, and imagination were key. You can do it! You can definitely do it! Mrs. Fuller paced around the classroom excitedly. You can win! I know it! And there's a prize, a ticket to the future. Free tuition at a boarding school for gifted children. It's a prestigious school. First, the most prestigious universities queue up for graduates from there, and then employers. You have every chance to such a future. Jake, already contemplating his future, understood the importance of participating in the competition. The thought filled him with both anxiety and excitement. He feared he might not be up to the task. I will prepare you, Mrs. Fuller assured him, as if reading his thoughts. You are more deserving of this opportunity than anyone else. We'll study diligently, and you'll do fine. These lessons aren't enough, Mrs. Fuller fretted. We need to study on weekends as well. I'll speak to the principal about you visiting my house for additional lessons. You have immense potential, but you need a solid foundation. With hard work, everything will fall into place. The principal agreed, and even allocated funds from the orphanage's budget for bus fare. It wasn't a large sum, but it helped. For the first time in years, Jake found himself alone in the city. He boarded the correct bus and took a free seat. It was exhilarating to travel so freely through the city, gazing out the window. Mrs. Fuller met him at the bus stop. It was a little surprising to see her out-of-school office, but also pleasant. Their way passed through the public garden. They talked, laughed, joked. Jake suddenly imagined that he was just an ordinary teenager, walking next to his aunt or even his mum. They're discussing something, smiling. It's a typical picture. The people around them have no idea that this is what happiness looks like. To them it's all just normal, ordinary life. Yeah, it's wonderful how strange and complicated life is. Here's my house, he said, looking at the nondescript 7-story building. It was a standing dwelling, similar to where Jake had lived with his parents. Mrs. Fuller's apartment was familiar, mirroring his parents'. 2 bedrooms, a small cosy kitchen, living room. Mrs. Fuller wasn't wealthy, evident from the simple furniture and inexpensive wallpaper. Yet there was a warm, comforting atmosphere. Jake knew his teacher had a daughter, Ellie, his age. He was excited to meet her, imagining she must be as interesting as her mother. He hoped to befriend her, as he had few friends in his life. Mrs. Fuller seldom shared much about her daughter. They discussed an array of topics, but never about her. This made Ellie a mystery to Jake. However, as soon as Ellie walked into the apartment, Jake realized they would likely not be friends. At that moment, Mrs. Fuller was explaining complex topic to her student at the kitchen table. The kettle was boiling, an apple pie was baking in the oven, and Jake was looking forward to a pleasant tea party. Suddenly the door rattled open and a teenage girl appeared on the threshold. She wore a daring miniskirt, displaying her long thin legs with sharp knees, a tight top, and thick platform shoes. Her short greasy hair was dyed an odd green colour. Her large eyes were heavily lined with black, and her eyelashes were coated with thick mascara. Jake looked at the girl in surprise. He had pictured Ellie differently. Not exactly Jane Eyre, but certainly not like this. This image of Ellie reminded him of the aggressive girls from the orphanage. It wasn't just her appearance. Yes, maybe she liked this image, and everyone has the right to express themselves, but it was more than that. It was her cold, prickly gaze, her contemptuously pinched lips, and her deliberately swaggering movements. "Hello, Ellie," Mrs. Fuller smiled at her daughter. "This is Jake. I've told you about him, remember? He's preparing for a contest." "Hello," the boy waved at her. Ignoring his greeting, Ellie turned to her mother with a haughty look. "Is there anything to eat? I won't be long." "Yes," Mrs. Fuller bustled around, rushing to the refrigerator. "I'll eat in my room," Ellie declared, then left. Soon loud pop music came from Ellie's room. A few minutes later, the woman went to her daughter's room with a plate of pilaf in her hands. Jake didn't want to, but he overheard the teacher urging Ellie to turn down the volume because the noise was not conducive to learning. "This is my house. I do what I want. If he doesn't like it, he should go to his own house." However, the noise didn't last long. Ellie had a snack and was in the kitchen again, this time wearing ultra-short shorts. "What are you staring at?" she snapped at Jake. "Do you like me?" Jake blushed. "Where are you going? When are you coming back?" Mrs. Fuller exclaimed anxiously. She didn't comment on her daughter's appearance, because it was apparently fruitless. "None of your business," the girl retorted rudely, before slipping out the door. "Well, we can now proceed with the lesson," Mrs. Fuller remarked sadly. "Why? Why is she like this?" Jake asked, clearly taken aback. After a moment he realized that such a conversation might be unpleasant for Mrs. Fuller. The teacher sighed sadly, sat down opposite him, and began to speak. "You're mature now. You understand many things. I failed to raise my daughter properly. I teach other children, yet my own is out of control." Mrs. Fuller raised Ellie all by herself. She had never been married. Ellie's father was the kind of man who avoided responsibility, liked adventures and taking a risk. Fate somehow crossed his path with a quiet, modest girl who, for the first time in her life, had gone to a disco with her friends. What attracted him to her? Perhaps it was simply her difference from him, a sort of exotic allure. Being an experienced man, he could easily captivate a naive young woman. He knew how to be interesting, knew how to organize exciting entertainment. He tried on different roles and played them masterfully, enjoying himself. However, he disappeared after a week, as if he had never been there. The girl fell in love with him and spent a long time searching for this enigmatic man, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. He probably wasn't a local. The whirlwind, but short affair, left Mrs. Fuller with a daughter. At the time, I was even glad. I held on to the hope that he would return and see me with a baby. I thought his heart would be moved, and we would live together. Of course, I eventually realized that this was all wishful thinking. By that time, Mrs. Fuller had graduated from the pedagogical college and secured a job at the local school. However, she had to go on maternity leave, and money became tight. She lived with her mother, surviving on her mother's small pension and an even smaller child allowance. Mrs. Fuller then began tutoring. She spent her days in other people's apartments, instilling the granite of science into mostly indifferent students. Their parents were willing to pay generously for their children's education, but the children themselves lacked the desire. Mrs. Fuller had to overcome their reluctance and laziness, and sometimes even disgust. It wasn't pleasant, but it paid well. Ellie's grandmother cared for her, and was the first to notice the warning signs. She often complained, "Ellie is too willful, always restless, and doesn't listen to me. I discipline her, but she's indifferent. Today, she deliberately cut up my favourite sweater with scissors, just to spite me." She watched my reason while claiming it was an accident. "Mum, what are you saying?" Mrs. Fuller tiredly retorted. "She's only 2.5 years old. What revenge? What disobedience? She's just exploring the world, that's normal." Mrs. Fuller cherished the moments when her daughter would run to greet her at the door each evening. The first thing the girl would do was to rummage through her bag, looking for treats, and she always found a chocolate bar, sweet fruit or flavoured buns. Mrs. Fuller tried to please her daughter. After all, who else would? She had no father. Time passed. Ellie started kindergarten and Mrs. Fuller began teaching at the school again. This transition brought new challenges. Ellie's educators began complaining about her disruptive behaviour. She lied, fought with the other children, provoked boys into pranks, and was generally disobedient. Mrs. Fuller promised to address the situation with her daughter. At home, however, Ellie behaved like an angel, leading her mother to believe that the teachers and her grandmother were unfairly maligning her. Then Mrs. Fuller's mother suddenly passed away from a heart attack. It was terrible and dark time for Mrs. Fuller, but she had. So from now on, Mrs. Fuller alone brought up Ellie, who was about to go to the 1st grade. It was then that the woman had to admit that something was amiss. Ellie was adamantly refusing to learn and showed no interest in reading, writing, or performing basic arithmetic. Mrs. Fuller worked tirelessly with her daughter, patiently tolerating her tantrums and complaints. Only threats seemed to work. "Read this page, solve these math tasks, and then you can go outside. Otherwise you will stay home." Ellie was desperate to avoid being confined indoors, which felt like a prison to her. She would yell at her mother, call her names, and throw her textbooks against the wall, but she ultimately had to comply with her demands. At that time, Ellie was physically weaker than her mother. As she grew older, Ellie began to push her mother aside, venturing out into the streets or sneaking around while her mother was at work. Mrs. Fuller couldn't keep an eye on her daughter around the clock. Occasionally, Ellie would not return home from school, choosing instead to roam the neighbourhood with questionable friends. Mrs. Fuller was deeply concerned for her daughter, but was at a loss about what to do. Neither prohibition nor locks. Ellie lied, disrespected her mother, and even stole valuables from their home, presumably to sell for spending money. Mrs. Fuller first noticed the smell of cigarettes on her 10-year-old daughter, and by 13, Ellie had come home drunk. Mrs. Fuller tried talking to her daughter, warning her of the dangers that awaited her on the streets, but Ellie merely smiled condescendingly at her mother, dismissing her warnings. "What do you know about a free life, about the street?" she retorted. "You've spent your entire life fulfilling the wishes and expectations of others. I don't care what people say. I was born free, and that scares you. I am nothing like you." Ellie disturbingly took after her father, whom she had never known or seen. She was the same easy adventurer, the same liar, the same actor, the same adventurer, rejecting the rules, just like him. Mrs. Fuller struggled to steer her daughter away from this path, hoping that education could conquer genetics. She sought help from psychologists and psychotherapists, tried to befriend Ellie, and sought to instill more willpower in her. However, all her efforts were in vain. As Ellie grew older, the gap between them only widened. Their relationship was starkly different from the bond Mrs. Fuller had with her own mother, which was filled with mutual support and shared interests. Ellie seemed to resent her mother for her mundane, simple life and intellectualism. The girl herself considered herself an ideal. She could afford to do what she wanted. For example, to swear at the teacher in class because the teacher was critical of her appearance, or to smoke right on the school porch. "Maybe it's just her age," Jake suggested after listening to the teacher. The pain in Mrs. Fuller's eyes was so deep that he felt compelled to offer some comfort. "That's what I hope. Puberty will pass. Ellie will calm down, come to her senses, and think about the future. My fear is that something might happen to her in the meantime. But we're getting off track. You need to study. Open the textbook to page 38. Jake visited Mrs. Fuller every Sunday. They rigorously prepared for the competition while enjoying fragrant tea and deliciously homemade pastries. They also engaged in fascinating conversations. Mrs. Fuller was careful to answer all of Jake's questions, never dismissing a single one. She emanated wisdom and empathy. At times, Ellie would be home during these lessons. One day, she barged into the hallway. She reeked of alcohol and tobacco smoke, her legs unsteady. It was late morning, and it seemed like Ellie hadn't been home the previous night. The girl passed out in the hallway. Jake assisted his teacher in moving the unconscious Ellie to her bed. "That's how we live," Mrs. Fuller sighed later. "Nothing seems to work with her." Ellie was even more challenging than the aggressive girls from the orphanage. Those girls were hardened by their difficult circumstances and the need to fight for survival. But what about Ellie? She had everything: clothes, her own room, and delicious food. Most importantly, she had such a wonderful mother. Once, Ellie insulted Mrs. Fuller in front of Jake. The woman had merely asked her daughter if she would be back for dinner, and already irritated, Ellie lashed out with an angry tirade at her. Unable to bear such words, Jake stood up for Mrs. Fuller, who didn't deserve such treatment. But Ellie jumped up and slapped Jake so hard that his vision momentarily went black. "Are you going to tell me what to do in my own house?" Ellie's eyes blazed with a menacing fire. From then on, Jake thought that Ellie was crazy, sick, and once Jake confided in his teacher about his suspicions regarding her. "No, there's nothing wrong with her psyche. When Ellie was still agreeable, I took her to several psychiatrists. The diagnosis was unanimous. Everything is within normal limits." Jake never discussed Mrs. Fuller's difficult daughter with anyone else. The teacher didn't ask him to keep it a secret, but he decided it himself. The only exception was Alberta. They always shared everything with each other. "Ellie doesn't realize how fortunate she is." Alberta shook her head. "If only I had a mother like hers." As the contest date approached, a major problem surfaced. The participants had to fund their own transportation. This included tickets for the child and a guardian, hotel accommodation for several days, and meals. "No, I can't afford such an expense." The orphanage principal immediately rejected the idea. "We need to fix the roof. Many of the children have outgrown their warm clothes." Jake overheard Mrs. Fuller trying to persuade the principal. She argued that Jake's participation in the competition was his chance at a normal life. She also pointed out that the potential benefits for the orphanage if Jake won. "You'll attract many sponsors after this. The roof will be repaired, the children will have new clothes, and a sports ground will be built." But he has to win for that benefits. What are the guarantees? "He has a lot of potential." "I can't believe our student will outperform everyone at an event of this magnitude." Jake heard every word and suddenly felt a chill. Due to financial difficulties, he might not even compete. Had all his practice, effort, and hope been in vain? He had a goal, a dream, and now it felt like it had been yanked away. "I'll figure something out," Mrs. Fuller reassured Jake, who was struggling to contain her tears. "Don't worry, we'll find the money. We'll attend this contest, you'll see." Since then, Mrs. Fuller had been relentlessly approaching the administration
and even city businessmen. However, it seemed no one believed in the talent of the boy from the orphanage, and her proposals fell on deaf ears. Jake appreciated his teacher's endeavours, but he had already come to accept that he would likely fail. It seemed inevitable. Yet she managed to secure the funds. One morning before lesson, Mrs. Fuller approached Jake, who usually arrived before everyone else. "We're going," Mrs. Fuller informed Jake, her eyes shining with joy. "I've managed to find the right amount of money." "Where? How?" The boy felt his heart pound in his chest like a trapped animal. "There are still good people in the world," the teacher vaguely explained. Only on the eve of their departure, Jake discovered where Mrs. Fuller had taken out money. As usual, he visited his teacher on Sunday. He hoped he wouldn't run into Ellie, but unfortunately she was home. "What's up, nerd? Are you happy about going to the capital?" Ellie sneered at him. "My mother took a loan out because of you. It would be better to buy branded sneakers for her daughter, but no, she'd rather spend her money on some nonsense like your useless contest. She's pissing me off on purpose." "Mrs. Fuller, have you done this for my sake?" Jake asked his teacher. Blushing as if embarrassed by her actions, the woman replied, "Don't think that way. I've wanted to go to the capital for a long time. Plus, this is a great opportunity. The principal will increase my salary after your victory. It will help me pay off my loan. Everything will be all right." After hearing this, Jake made up his mind to win, no matter what. He couldn't let Mrs. Fuller down, and indeed, he won the contest. Standing on stage under the spotlight, he felt calm and clear-headed. The theme was challenging, almost a misfortune, but Jake delivered a monologue that earned him a long applause. The results were to be announced the next day. Mrs. Fuller was anxious. "Objectively, you were the best, but we can't ignore the possibility of favoritism or connections," she warned. Jake wasn't among the initial laureates. Third place wasn't his. Second place still wasn't his. As Mrs. Fuller looked hopefully at the stage, Jake had almost accepted defeat. But then the presenter called his name. The hall erupted in applause. First place! Victory! Everything happened so quickly that Jake barely had time to comprehend it. When he returned to the orphanage, he was hailed like a champion. Alberta wept tears of joy, and Mrs. Fuller beamed with happiness that everything had turned out well. Soon after, representatives from a boarding school for gifted children came to take Jake. They spent a couple of days settling formalities, preparing documents, and learning about the boy's past. Jake realized he was being taken to a new life, one he deserved, according to Mrs. Fuller. He now had a promising future. Jake was set to become strong, intelligent, and wealthy. He had won the golden ticket, thanks to Mrs. Fuller's efforts and Alberta's support. Saying goodbye to them was difficult. They were the closest people to him. Alberta was worried about his departure. How will she cope without him for the next years? Who will protect her? Mrs. Fuller promised to take care of her. Still, the thought of being away from his loved ones was daunting for Jake and filled him with longing. However, Jake knew it was worth the temporary sacrifice. After a few years, he would become a successful and affluent individual. He was determined to make it happen. Then he would express his gratitude to Mrs. Fuller and ensure that Alberta lived a life akin to a fairy tale. Jake managed to achieve the second goal, but not immediately. Initially, he spent 3 years at a boarding school for gifted children. It was like a palace, complete with a luxurious garden, private rooms, and state-of-the-art classrooms. He was surrounded by intelligent, motivated peers, and it was here that he made friends. They had a lot in common, and friendships naturally formed. The teachers at the boarding school were attentive to their students' abilities and worked to nurture them. These were knowledgeable and approachable people, and interacting with them was enriching. However, Jake did not form as close a bond with any of them as he had with his former teacher.
He often thought of Mrs. Fuller, hoping she wasn't struggling with paying that loan or being mistreated by Ellie. After graduating from the boarding school, Jake was admitted to a prestigious university. He received scholarship, accommodation in dormitory, and continued guidance from mentors. As a student, Jake found employment with a good salary, and he could finally visit his hometown. The young man eagerly anticipated seeing Mrs. Fuller and Alberta. There was no problem in finding Alberta. The principal of the orphanage gave the address of the apartment where the girl lived after graduating from the orphanage. The apartment was a dismal, tiny place in an old, shabby apartment building on the city outskirts. Alberta had graduated from sewing school and was working as an assistant dressmaker in an atelier. "I thought you'd never come back." Alberta's eyes sparkled like stars upon seeing Jake. "You've changed so much." "I couldn't leave you," Jake responded, embracing Alberta. "I've missed you so much. You won't have to live here anymore, not even for another day." That same evening, Jake helped Alberta move into his parents' apartment. It remained empty all this time. Knowing that Alberta would be living in better conditions gave him peace of mind. Moreover, the thought of a loved one living in his childhood home brought comfort. As for Mrs. Fuller, she could not be found. Her apartment was now occupied by new tenants. "The owner sold it to us 2 years ago," said a woman in a robe who opened the door to Jake. "She and her daughter moved to the country, I heard. I don't know the details, and I don't need to." Jake returned to the capital to continue his studies and work. However, he went back to his hometown during every vacation, where Alberta was waiting for him. After graduating, Jake started working at the diplomatic corps. He was immediately offered a responsible, high-paying position. As Mrs. Fuller predicted, his victory in a prestigious competition became his ticket to a successful life. Now, Jake's life seemed to be following a carefully planned path. Everything seemed to fall into place automatically. Jake bought an apartment in the capital, and Alberta moved in with him. They got married. Despite the demands of his job, Jake steadily climbed the career ladder. Alberta enjoyed her role as a mother and a wife, and Jake made several attempts to find Mrs. Fuller, but all were in vain. Her whereabouts were lost after she moved from her old apartment. Jake deeply wanted to thank her again and show her his accomplishments, to prove that her efforts were not wasted. He believed that such a kind woman deserved more than just verbal gratitude. Years later, Jake realized his job in the diplomatic corps was consuming too much of his time and energy. He was missing important and joyous moments in his life. He missed his son's first day at school due to an urgent meeting, and his daughter's first ballet performance because of crucial negotiations. So, he decided to venture into the restaurant business when the opportunity arose. And now, Jake was looking at the woman near the trash cans and couldn't believe his eyes. This resemblance was unnerving, but surely the poor woman couldn't be Mrs. Fuller. His teacher had a home, a job, and presumably a pension. "Hello, Jake," the woman greeted him with a sad smile. "So, that's how you've grown. You've become handsome, grown up, strong, just as I once dreamed." "Mrs. Fuller?" Jake queried, struggling to believe the situation. The woman nodded in affirmation. Jake invited her to go into his office, and on the way, they both expressed their joy at the chance meeting, each in his own way. Mrs. Fuller smiled warmly and a little embarrassed, while Jake told her excitedly about his life and how long he had been looking for her. Once in his office, Jake gestured for Mrs. Fuller to sit on the cosy sofa in the corner, set aside for guests. He then prepared coffee for her, serving it with a plate of cookies. "Mrs. Fuller, it's just a miracle that we've met. I've thought so much of you and have been searching for you for so long. I wanted you to see what I've become, thanks to you." "Thanks to yourself," corrected the elderly woman, looking at Jake with pride. "Talented, persistent, hard-working. These qualities have led to your success." You must realize that if it weren't for you, I don't know what I would have become. You'd still be a good man without me, and you would still be successful, albeit perhaps not so soon. I can tell when a kid has a backbone. Trust me, I've had a lot of experience. But why do you... Jake hesitated, choosing his words. How did you end up in this situation? It's clear that you're in need, and... It's clear that I've become an old beggar. Speak straight, sighed Mrs. Fuller. It was evident that she was uncomfortable in front of her former student, ashamed that he saw her in this state. Can you tell me about it? All right, nodded Mrs. Fuller. It's a long story, and its ending isn't unexpected for me. Everything was leading up to it. After Jake was sent to a boarding school for gifted children, Mrs. Fuller started facing severe problems with Ellie. The 16-year-old girl began spending nights at unknown places with unfamiliar people, often returning home only in the morning, or sometimes several days later. Occasionally, the police would bring her back after Mrs. Fuller sought their help, since Ellie was underage. Mrs. Fuller tried everything to control her daughter. Pleas, threats, heartfelt discussions. But Ellie remained unaffected. Mrs. Fuller even tried to lock her in the house when she went to work, but Ellie, craving freedom, once escaped through a balcony by tying sheets together and descending from the 4th floor. After this incident, Mrs. Fuller stopped locking her daughter in, fearing for her safety. Ellie now only communicated with her mother using harsh language. All valuable items in the house, including Mrs. Fuller's modest jewellery and household appliances, mysteriously disappeared. Once, someone even took the washing machine, while Mrs. Fuller was out. Ellie needed money for her entertainment. Mrs. Fuller, who had tried to instill a love for books, theatre, and learning new things from an early age, was devastated to see her daughter having no other interests in life. Sad mother partially blamed her daughter's friends' negative influences for her troubles. Teenagers from dysfunctional families who neither studied nor worked were Ellie's best friends. Mrs. Fuller saw representatives of this society, glassy, absolutely empty heads, the stamp of limitation on their faces, ungroomed, always some grey and ragged, and these people somehow had a great influence on her daughter. Ellie's young body couldn't handle the strain and she was hospitalized a few times. Doctors warned that if she continued down this path, the results could be fatal. The terrified mother decided to take drastic action, moving her daughter to a village. She planned to sell their apartment, buy a house in a remote village, and remove her daughter from the harmful environment. She believed that the fresh air, physical labour, severed ties, and a change of scenery would help Ellie come to her senses. It was hard, leaving everything, selling the apartment, with no guarantees that Ellie would get better, but I had to try. I had to do something. Did you take her to the doctors? Of course. I even managed to get her into a clinic once, but she ran away and then refused to see any specialists. She was content with everything and didn't see herself as sick. You can't drag a girl like that into the right life with a lasso. Initially, she refused to move to the village, so Mrs. Fuller had to go alone. The woman was at a loss. She had initiated the move solely for her daughter's sake, and yet Ellie found a workaround and stayed in the city, living with someone from her company. Unfortunately, the mother herself pushed her daughter to become even closer to these. But then Ellie returned, angry, skinny, and dishevelled, quickly becoming like the people she enjoyed spending time with. Mrs. Fuller knew her daughter was living with her friend, but apparently the crowded apartment, lack of money, and constant shouting and quarrels didn't suit Ellie as well. Needing a place to live, a frustrated girl returned to her mother, who would always provide food and a clean bed. Mrs. Fuller felt a slight relief because her plan to bring Ellie back on track worked out. Unfortunately, nothing like that. It didn't take long for Ellie's old friends to start visiting the village, and sometimes she'd travel the 150 kilometres to visit them in the city. Moreover, sociable Ellie found a similar crowd in the village. She began frequenting a house with an unkempt garden, a leaky roof, and a woman with 3 children from different men who hosted endless parties. One day, Mrs. Fuller noticed her daughter Ellie's rounded belly, indicating that she was pregnant. "What's the big deal? I'm 18 and have the right to be pregnant." Ellie shrugged when Mrs. Fuller shared her suspicions. "And who's the father? Is he from our village?" Mrs. Fuller inquired. "No, he's from the city. But honestly, I don't remember his name or what he looks like. We met at a club," Ellie replied, reminding her mother of her own youthful indiscretions. Mrs. Fuller clutched at her heart, while Ellie smiled, enjoying the shock she'd given her mother. Despite her pregnancy, Ellie continued with her usual lifestyle, drinking, smoking, and disappearing into the city or the village house. Her mother's pleas to stop drinking fell on dead ears, as Ellie seemed indifferent to the fate of her unborn child. "None of your business." This was the sole response Mrs. Fuller received to her pleas. Her grandson Tommy was born prematurely. He was incredibly small and frail. His mother, Ellie, was rushed to the maternity hospital from the street when she began to experience contractions. The baby was born weak and ill, and stayed in the hospital while Ellie was discharged. Once free, she returned to her old lifestyle, leaving Mrs. Fuller to visit Tommy and consult the doctors. Tommy's condition was dire. Ellie's lifestyle during her pregnancy had negatively impacted him. Underdevelopment of most organs and systems, heart defects, the doctors said, and added that if the baby survived, he would be a disabled individual requiring lifelong care. His life expectancy was also likely to be short. Ellie was determined to write a refusal on her son. "Why do I need him? He's an invalid, and I'll have another baby, a healthy one." Mrs. Fuller was horrified by these words. She tried to convince her daughter that this was unacceptable. After all, he is a living person. To the elderly mother's relief, Ellie changed her mind. She decided to take Tommy home after her friend gave her some advice. This was the same woman in whose house the village drunkards used to hang out. "There are allowances for children. If he's invalid, it's even more money." That was the advice. Tommy was discharged. His arrival didn't change Ellie's lifestyle. She continued to live freely, coming home only to eat and sleep in a comfortable environment. She was receiving Tommy's allowance, which made her even more popular among her friends. Mrs. Fuller stopped trying to reason with her daughter, finally realizing it was futile. She didn't blame herself for what happened to Ellie. She knew she had given her daughter enough time and had done everything she could to raise her properly. It was not her fault she had failed. Now Mrs. Fuller dedicated herself to Tommy, providing his medical care, aiding in his development, and taking him to the doctors. People, including doctors, wondered where the child's mother was and why this grandmother was raising him. But Mrs. Fuller lied to everyone, claiming her daughter was working hard to provide for her son, and she, the grandmother, was just helping the young mother with her disabled child. No, the woman was not ashamed of her daughter's behavior. She had stopped fearing people's judgment long ago. Her fear was different. She was afraid that her daughter might lose her paternal rights and that her grandson Tommy would be taken away. It was unlikely that he would be left with his grandmother due to the poor living conditions, her advanced age, and her meagre income. Therefore, Mrs. Fuller played this play out for her grandson's sake. Then Ellie brought home her husband, a grown man with reddened, clouded eyes from constant drinking, and announced he would now live with them. Mrs. Fuller thought things couldn't get worse or harder, but she was wrong. This man, Alejandro, made her life a living hell. He dashingly emptied the refrigerator, not caring about its filling. He did not care that these fruits or milk Mrs. Fuller bought for Tommy with her last money. Alejandro never cleaned up after himself, would shout at Ellie and Mrs. Fuller if something displeased him, and sometimes even resorted to violence. To make matters worse, Alejandro's friends began visiting their home regularly. It was intolerable. They would stay up all night in the kitchen, swearing, laughing loudly, filling the house with cigarette smoke, clinking glasses, and sometimes even fighting. Tommy tossed and turned in his sleep, while Mrs. Fuller sat beside him. She was afraid to go to sleep. What if there was a fire or something? No, she had to be on the alert. Ellie, however, was content with everything. "I couldn't leave. How could I leave Tommy with them?" Mrs. Fuller wiped away sudden tears. "Tommy, he loved me. I was his only hope. I endured all of this for his sake. I would have left a long time ago. In fact, that's what I did when Tommy—" The disabled boy was predicted to live a short life from the very beginning. Yet Mrs. Fuller clung to the hope of medical breakthroughs and the power of modern medicine. At first, the baby seemed to be doing well, but then he caught pneumonia, which was fatal to his poor health. Mrs. Fuller went to the hospital with him. Then the child was transferred to the intensive care unit. And then he died. Mrs. Fuller wept for days after the doctors had delivered the dreadful news. Ellie and her friends also mourned, but their sorrow stemmed from the loss of their income source. "Well, we'll have more babies," she shrugged in the end. "It's not a hard thing to do?" Alejandro grinned. Upon hearing this conversation, Mrs. Fuller realized she could no longer live with her daughter, this cold, terrifying, inhuman creature. "I packed my belongings and fled to the capital. My pension is small, and my daughter once took loans in my name. Now the bailiffs deduct from my pension. I receive hardly anything, but time is passing, and I'll soon settle all my debts. I live in a hostel with no space of my own, but it's preferable than enduring Ellie and Alejandro's antics. I often struggle to find food, so I walk near restaurants and cafes at night. Sometimes they leave uneaten food for the homeless. I didn't even know you owned all this, Jake." Jake shook his head, struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. Mrs. Fuller, a kind, compassionate, and talented teacher, was living such a terrible way. His heart ached for this remarkable woman. She didn't deserve such a fate, but things would now change for the better for her. "Believe it or not," Jake began, "I have been searching for you for a long time, just to express my gratitude. Now that I've found you, you will have your own cozy, clean apartment, similar to what you used to have. You're an excellent teacher who loves your work, and people need your knowledge. I have friends whose children require extra lessons. They would be enormously thankful for a tutor like you, and they'll pay well, trust me, so you can work part-time as a tutor if you like, of course. I don't want to impose on you, Jake. Consider it a repayment of a debt. It must have been challenging for you to pay off the loan you took out to send me to the contest. And honestly, this help is no burden to me now. I'm just happy. I also want you to meet my children, and my wife, Alberta, will be delighted to see you." Mrs. Fuller smiled as she looked at her former pupil. "Yes, I'm also eager to meet your children and see Alberta. I'm so happy for you. Thank you, Jake." Mrs. Fuller was really glad. In spite of her bitter fate, she knew that now she might not have a white streak ahead of her, but certainly not a black one, as it had been before.